Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight, wherever you are right now. Whether you're in bed, lying on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle, let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you'd like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. The house was the kind of place you might drive past without a second glance, a weathered, two-story structure with a sagging porch and peeling paint. It sat at the end of a quiet street, framed by tall, bare trees that swayed even when there was no wind. For the price I paid, I knew I couldn't expect much. After the divorce, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. This house was my fresh start. I pulled into the gravel driveway with my second-hand sedan packed to the brim. The sight of the house didn't intimidate me the way it might have when I was younger. Life had already thrown its worst at me. Heartbreak, sleepless nights, and a gnawing sense of failure. What was a creaky old house compared to that? The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying leaves as I unlocked the front door. It creaked on its hinges, a sound I knew I'd grow familiar with. Inside, the air was stale, as though the house had been holding its breath for years. The hardwood floors groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, and my first thought was that it felt colder than it should. But it was November, and the house hadn't been heated in months. I spent the afternoon unpacking, trying to ignore the way the floorboards seemed to whisper with every step. The previous owner had left a few pieces of furniture, a battered couch, an antique mirror hanging crookedly in the hallway, and a dining table scarred with deep scratches that looked almost deliberate. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I sat on the couch with a microwave dinner balanced on my lap, the television flickering weakly in the corner. The only channel that worked played reruns of old sitcoms. I laughed half-heartedly, not because it was funny, but because I needed a distraction. As the night deepened, the house settled into its own rhythm. The wind outside howled softly, and the branches of the trees tapped against the windows. The floor creaked upstairs, even though I hadn't been up there. I told myself it was just the house adjusting to its new occupant. The first night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep well. The mattress in the bedroom was lumpy, and I kept waking up to the sound of faint scratching. I tried to convince myself it was mice or some other pest. It wasn't like I hadn't dealt with that before. The next morning, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Hastings. She was the type of elderly woman who seemed like she'd lived in the neighborhood forever. Her gray hair was tied in a neat bun, and her expression hovered between friendly and wary. "Moving into the old Tucker place, huh?" she said, squinting at me over the fence as I lugged a box to the porch. "I guess so," I replied, setting the box down. "You've been here a while." "Oh, long enough to know that house has a history," she said, lowering her voice. "Strange things happen there, you know. Folks don't stay long." I smiled politely, assuming she was just the type to spin small-town legends. "What kind of strange things?" Her eyes darted to the house, then back to me. Footsteps at night, shadows where there shouldn't be, and, well, there was that couple a few years back, left in the middle of the night, screaming about curses and ghosts. Never saw them again. I laughed nervously. Sounds like a good story to tell around a campfire. She didn't laugh. Instead, she looked at me with an almost pitying expression. "Just be careful," she said before retreating to her house. I brushed it off, but her words stuck with me throughout the day. Still, I wasn't the superstitious type. Life was hard enough without worrying about ghosts or curses. As the days passed, I settled into a routine. I'd wake up early, brew a pot of coffee, and spend my mornings job hunting online. The afternoons were quieter, filled with small repairs around the house. The pipes groaned when I turned the taps, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up. None of it seemed unusual for a house this old, but the nights were a different story. The scratching I'd heard on the first night grew louder and more insistent. It seemed to come from inside the walls, directly behind the headboard of my bed. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to sleep through. On the fourth night, I heard something new. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow, moving across the floor above me. My heart pounded as I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear more. It had to be my imagination, I told myself. Or maybe an animal had gotten into the attic. The next morning, I decided to check the attic. The entrance was a small hatch in the hallway ceiling, with a rickety pull-down ladder that groaned under my weight. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with the smell of mildew. I shone a flashlight around, but there was nothing unusual. Just old insulation, cobwebs, and a broken chair in the corner. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. The attic visit stayed with me long after I'd climbed back down the rickety ladder. There was nothing up there, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't like me to spook so easily. I'd always considered myself a rational person, but the atmosphere in the house seemed to get heavier with each passing day, like the air was pressing down on me. That night, I tried to put the attic out of my mind. I curled up on the couch with a mug of tea and an old paperback, letting the familiar smell of paper and ink soothe me. Outside, the wind howled like a restless animal, rattling the windows. The occasional creak of the floorboards became a background noise I barely noticed anymore. Around midnight, just as I was considering heading to bed, a sharp sound jolted me upright. A loud bang, like something heavy falling. It came from upstairs. I froze, listening intently. The house was silent for a moment. Then I heard it again, a thud, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards. My heart raced as I set my mug down and grabbed the flashlight I kept on the end table. Probably just something shifting, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to my own ears. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the hallway. The bedroom door was ajar, just as I'd left it, but the air felt colder than before. I stepped inside cautiously, half expecting to find something or someone waiting for me. Nothing. The room was empty, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. The old mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed was tilted at an angle, as if someone had grabbed it and yanked it askew. I straightened it with trembling hands, trying not to look too closely at my own reflection. There was something unsettling about the way the dim light from the hallway lamp played across the glass, warping my features. I checked the rest of the upstairs rooms, but everything seemed normal. By the time I got back to bed, I felt foolish for letting my imagination run wild. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone or something had been in the house with me. The next morning, I decided to pay Mrs. Hastings another visit. I found her tending to a small garden in her backyard, her gloved hands dusted with soil. She looked up as I approached, her expression softening into a polite smile. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "I wanted to ask you about what you mentioned the other day, about the house's history." Her smile faltered. She straightened, brushing her hands off on her apron. "What about it?" Well, I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Have you ever heard anything unusual about it? Like strange noises or things being out of place?" Her eyes darkened and she glanced toward my house. "I told you, that place has a history. The man who built it, Jeremiah Foster, was a strange one, obsessed with all sorts of dark stuff. People around here say he was into the occult, held seances, did rituals. Some even say he tried to summon something. Summon what? I asked, my stomach nodding. She shrugged, her expression grim. Something that shouldn't be summoned, that's for sure. He disappeared one day, vanished without a trace. That was almost 50 years ago. Since then, no one stayed in that house for long. Her words lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the stories. The tilted mirror, the footsteps, the cold spots. Maybe they weren't just the quirks of an old house. That evening, I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. Armed with my flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I searched every room, opening drawers, checking behind furniture, and tapping on walls. It wasn't until I reached the basement that I found something. The basement door was stiff, and I had to shove it with my shoulder to get it open. The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. The single bare bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind an old bookshelf, was a small wooden chest. It looked ancient, the wood warped and cracked with age. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a collection of items that sent a chill down my spine. There were black candles, their wicks burned down to stubs, a stack of yellowed papers covered in strange symbols and illegible handwriting, and at the very bottom, a leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal and flipped it open, the pages crackling beneath my fingers. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though the writer had been in a hurry or frightened. The first entry was dated 50 years ago. It described the construction of the house and the writer's excitement about moving in. But as I skimmed through the pages, the tone grew darker. The writer, Jeremiah Foster, spoke of strange occurrences, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, whispers in the dead of night, and a growing sense that he was being watched. Toward the end of the journal, the entries became frantic. Jeremiah wrote about rituals he performed in an attempt to control whatever he had summoned, but it was clear they hadn't worked. His final entry was a scrawled warning. Asterisk, it's awake. I can't stop it. If you're reading this, leave while you still can. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. The oppressive silence of the basement seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me from all sides. Then I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. Get out. I bolted from the basement, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. My heart pounded as I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, struggling to catch my breath. My rational mind tried to explain the whisper, a draft, the creak of an old house settling, but deep down I knew better. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, every creak and groan of the house magnified in the stillness. Sleep didn't come easily. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were plagued by shadowy figures and whispered warnings. The next morning, I awoke with the journal still sitting on the coffee table. The memory of the basement and Jeremiah Foster's frantic entries felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't shake. But the ache in my chest from the restless night reminded me it was all too real. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I spent the day poring over the journal. Jeremiah had been meticulous in his recordings, detailing the rituals he performed, the materials he used, and the results, or lack thereof. One entry stood out. It described a night when he claimed to have seen a figure standing at the foot of his bed. He wrote about waking to the sound of footsteps, feeling the air grow icy cold, and seeing the silhouette of a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes. Asterisk, it doesn't speak, but I feel its intentions. It's not human. I've made a mistake. This thing isn't bound to the house. It's bound to me. Asterisk. The word sent chills down my spine. Was that what I'd heard in the basement? Was it still here, lingering in the house, waiting? I couldn't stay cooped up inside any longer. Grabbing my coat, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The crisp air and sunshine helped clear my head. But my thoughts kept circling back to the journal and Jeremiah Foster's warnings. I ended up at Mrs. Hastings' house again. She greeted me with a wary smile, sensing my unease before I even said a word. "Back so soon?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I found something," I said, hesitating. "A journal. It belonged to the original owner, Jeremiah Foster. He wrote about strange things happening in the house. Do you know anything about that?" Her face darkened, and she ushered me inside, closing the door firmly behind us. "I told you that house was trouble," she said, her voice low. "Jeremiah was a fool, messing with things he didn't understand. He thought he could control it, but no one can. That's why he disappeared. He didn't leave. He was taken." "Taken?" I echoed, my stomach sinking. Mrs. Hastings nodded grimly. "Whatever he summoned, it didn't leave when he vanished. It's still there, waiting for the next person to come along. That house isn't just haunted, it's cursed." Her words hung heavy in the air. I wanted to dismiss them as superstition, but the evidence was piling up. The noises, the cold spots, the whisper in the basement. They weren't just my imagination. "Is there a way to stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Mrs. Hastings shook her head. "I don't know, but if I were you, I wouldn't stick around to find out." I thanked her and left, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe her, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Maybe it was time to leave. That night, I packed a bag, intending to spend the night at a motel. But as I was heading to the door, a loud crash echoed through the house. It sounded like glass shattering. I froze, my grip tightening on the doorknob. The sound had come from the living room. Slowly, I turned around and walked back, every step heavier than the last. The mirror above the fireplace was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. Written on the wall, in jagged letters that looked as though they'd been carved into the plaster, were the words, "Asterisk, you can't leave." Asterisk. I stood frozen in the living room, staring at the jagged letters carved into the wall. Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk, my breath hitched as the words seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive. The room felt colder than before, the chill wrapping around me like icy fingers. My instinct was to run, but my legs refused to move. Suddenly, the creaking started again, slow, deliberate, and coming from directly above me. My gaze shot upward, but the ceiling revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the footsteps continued, each one reverberating through the old wood. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling so much that I could barely unlock the screen. Dialing 911 crossed my mind, but what would I even say? Asterisk, help, my house is haunted. Asterisk, they'd laugh. Or worse, think I'd lost my mind. Instead, I decided to confront whatever was upstairs. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was exhaustion, frustration, or a desperate need for answers. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and the courage I could muster, I crept up the staircase. The old steps groaned under my weight, each sound magnified in the silence. I paused halfway up, holding my breath as the creaking above stopped. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. When I reached the landing, the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the moonlight seeping through the dusty windows. The air was colder here, biting against my skin. Every door along the hallway was closed, but the one at the end, the door to the attic, stood slightly ajar. I hesitated, staring at that door as my heart pounded. I hadn't been up to the attic yet. The idea of opening it had always unsettled me. But now, it seemed like the source of everything wrong in this house. The creaking resumed, this time behind the attic door. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right in front of it. My hand reached for the doorknob, but I froze as a voice whispered from the other side. Asterisk, go away. Asterisk. It was faint but unmistakable. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment, I considered listening to it. But curiosity, or perhaps sheer stubbornness, pushed me to turn the knob and pull the door open. The attic was pitch black. the faint beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The smell of mildew and something foul hit me immediately, and I had to cover my nose to keep from gagging. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside, scanning the space for any signs of movement. That's when I saw it. A trunk sitting in the far corner of the room, its lid slightly ajar. It looked ancient, the wood darkened with age and the metal hinges rusted. The air around it felt heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight trained on the trunk. The closer I got, the stronger the foul smell became. It was a mix of rotting wood and something metallic like blood. As I reached the trunk, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I couldn't stop myself. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of objects that made my stomach churn. A tarnished silver dagger, a bundle of blackened candles, and what looked like an animal skull, its surface etched with strange symbols. But what caught my attention was a book. It was bound in cracked leather, the cover devoid of any title or markings. As I picked it up, a wave of nausea washed over me. The book felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. Flipping it open, I was greeted by pages filled with symbols and text I couldn't understand. The writing was jagged, almost frenzied, and the illustration sent shivers down my spine. Circles filled with runes, figures kneeling before strange shapes, and depictions of rituals that involved fire and blood. One page was different from the others. It featured a crude drawing of a house. Asterisk my house, asterisk beneath it was a single word, scrawled in bold letters. Asterisk bound, asterisk. Suddenly, the door to the attic slammed shut and the temperature plummeted. My flashlight flickered and a deep, guttural growl echoed through the room. I spun around, but the beam of light revealed nothing. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The growl grew louder, closer, and the room seemed to darken further. I backed away, clutching the book to my chest until I hit the wall. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, and a figure began to take shape in the shadows, a tall, thin silhouette with hollow eyes. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. It raised a hand, long fingers reaching toward me, and I felt an icy chill spread through my chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The pressure lifted, and the room was silent once more. My flashlight stopped flickering, its beam steady but weak. I didn't waste another second. Clutching the book, I bolted from the attic, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced as I stumbled down the stairs, my only thought being to get out of the house. But when I reached the front door, the carved words greeted me again. Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk, this time, they weren't just on the wall. They were etched into my mind, reverberating with a chilling finality. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The weight of the book sat heavily on my lap as I sat at the dining table. Every light in the house turned on. I flipped through the pages again and again, trying to make sense of the bizarre symbols and illustrations. My hands trembled with every turn, and that suffocating feeling from the attic lingered, like a shadow clinging to my back. The drawing of the house, asterisk my house, asterisk, stared up at me, mocking me with its bold, ominous letters. Asterisk bound, asterisk, bound to what? To whom? I thought about the figure in the attic, the cold, skeletal hand reaching for me. My mind refused to settle, every thought spiraling into darker corners. I needed answers. The only place I could think to start was the old woman next door, Mrs. Hensley. She had mentioned the house's unsettling history before, but I'd been too dismissive then to pry further. Now! I didn't have the luxury of ignorance. The sun had just started to rise when I knocked on her door, its light doing little to ease the chill that seemed to cling to my body. She opened it cautiously, peering out with tired eyes, her robe loosely tied around her frail frame. "Something wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I... I need to talk to you about the house, I said, my voice shaky. Please. It's important. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let me in. Her living room was cluttered with knickknacks and faded photographs, the faint smell of lavender and old books hanging in the air. We sat down and I wasted no time. You said something about the house being strange before, about people leaving suddenly. What did you mean? Her expression darkened, and she glanced toward the window as if checking for prying eyes. I was hoping you'd never have to find out, she murmured. Please, Mrs. Hensley, I need to know. She sighed, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. That house has a history, one that goes back decades, maybe longer. Everyone who's lived there has left. Or worse. Worse? I asked, leaning forward. She nodded, her face pale. There was a man who built the house. Jacob Willoughby, a reclusive sort, kept to himself mostly. But people in town said he was involved in strange things. The occult. They'd see him late at night in the woods behind the property, carrying lanterns and muttering to himself. Some claimed to hear chanting. Chanting? I echoed, a chill running down my spine. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And then one day he just disappeared. No one ever found him. But after that, everyone who moved into the house said they experienced strange things, voices, footsteps, objects moving on their own. Some even claimed to see him, standing in the shadows. Jacob Willoughby, I repeated, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. Do you know anything else about him? Anything that might help me? Mrs. Hensley hesitated, then rose from her chair and shuffled over to an old bookshelf. She pulled out a weathered folder and handed it to me. This is all I have, she said. Newspaper clippings, rumors, things I've collected over the years. Be careful, dear. That house, it doesn't let go easily. Her words hung heavy in the air as I left her house. The folder clutched tightly in my hands. Back home, I spread the contents of the folder across the dining table. Yellowed newspaper articles detailed strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena linked to the house. One headline read, Asterisk, local man vanishes. Occult practices suspected. Asterisk another. Asterisk, tenants FLE curse house. Asterisk, the deeper I dug, the more the pieces began to fit together. Jacob Willoughby had been obsessed with immortality, conducting rituals he believed would bind his soul to the house. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The articles hinted at dark forces, rituals interrupted, and a curse that seemed to linger over the property like a storm cloud. The book from the attic now made sense. It wasn't just a collection of notes. It was a guide, a manual for the rituals Jacob had performed. And the drawing of the house labeled bound confirmed my worst fear. I wasn't just living in the house. I was a part of its curse. That night, the house came alive again. It started with the creaking, louder and more erratic than before. Then the whispers began, soft at first, like a breeze brushing against my ear. But they grew louder, overlapping, until it sounded like a crowd of voices surrounding me. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the journal, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. And then I felt it. The mattress shifted, as though someone had sat down beside me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, as the air turned icy cold. My breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the frigid room. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I might see. The indent on the bed was undeniable, as if an invisible weight pressed down on it. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow, darker than the room itself, creeping along the wall. It stopped at the mirror across from me, and for a moment I saw it, Jacob Willoughby's face, gaunt and hollow, staring back at me. I screamed, dropping the book and stumbling out of the room. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frenzied as I fled down the stairs. The front door refused to budge, the carved words, Asterisk, you can't leave, asterisk, mocking me once again. I ran to the kitchen, fumbling with the locks on the back door, but they wouldn't move either. It was as if the house itself was alive, holding me prisoner within its walls. And then the growl returned, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. I spun around, my back pressed against the door, as the shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe. The figure from the attic emerged, its hollow eyes locked onto me. "Why?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, it spoke. Its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to echo in my mind. Asterisk you. Mine asterisk. I could hear my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears, drowning out the sound of the whispering shadows. My body felt numb, frozen in place as the figure in the doorway took a step toward me. The air in the room was thick with dread, the temperature plunging further with every breath I took. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house had wrapped itself around me, holding me in place, suffocating me in its grip. "You are mine." The words slithered through the room, each syllable making the hair on my neck stand on end. The figure advanced, its presence like a dark fog, a weight that pressed down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. And then, in the dim light of the kitchen, I saw it, the faintest glimmer in its eyes. Something familiar. It was the same face I had seen in the mirror. Jacob Willoughby. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. This wasn't just some shadowy apparition. It was him, Jacob, the man who had built this house, who had bound himself to it through his twisted rituals. His soul, trapped in the walls, still lingering here, reaching out to claim whoever dared to live in his cursed home. The figure's lips twisted into a grotesque grin, and I could feel it, his presence, his hunger. He wasn't just haunting the house. He was feeding off of me. I tried to speak, to ask why, but the words stuck in my throat. The shadow loomed closer, its coldness seeping into my bones, numbing me, making it harder to breathe. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. Jacob's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You were chosen," he rasped, his voice dripping with a twisted satisfaction. "Bound, like all the others before you. You can't escape." I stumbled backward, my hands searching for something, anything, to hold on to. The kitchen counter was slick under my fingers, as if the very surface was slick with sweat. The whispers in the walls grew louder, almost deafening, their voices an incoherent jumble of fear, anguish, and anger. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath me creaked, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate steps, moving with purpose, getting closer and closer. The figure in front of me faded for a moment, and I rushed to the door again, desperation flooding my every nerve. My hands were shaking so violently I could hardly get a grip on the handle. But when I tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, impossible to open. The footsteps above grew louder, closer. Each one felt like a drumbeat in my skull. My heart pounded in time with them, and I realized whatever was upstairs wasn't Jacob. It was something else, something more. Suddenly, the kitchen light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows seemed to stretch, curling around me like living things. I could feel them tugging at my skin, pulling me toward the heart of the house. The whispers were everywhere now, no longer just in the walls, but in my mind, thoughts that weren't mine, murmurs of dread and despair, words that I couldn't understand but that made me tremble nonetheless. I heard the footsteps again, much closer this time, just above me. A figure, a shape, appeared at the top of the stairs. It was human but distorted, its body bending at unnatural angles. Its face, pale and slack, was completely devoid of expression, but its eyes, those eyes, were black pits of nothingness, staring down at me like a predator about to pounce. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to listen. The figure stepped forward, slowly, with deliberate grace. Its movement was jerky, like a puppet on strings, and every time it moved, I could hear the unmistakable creak of the floorboards beneath it. It took another step, then another, until it was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. "Leave," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, just let me go." But it didn't move. It didn't respond. It just watched, the silence between us thick and suffocating. And then, out of nowhere, a shrill, bone-chilling scream filled the house, echoing from upstairs. The sound was so raw, so filled with pain and terror, that it sent me stumbling backward. The figure's eyes widened at the sound. Its head twitched as if trying to understand, and then, just as quickly, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. The silence returned, and I was left standing alone in the darkness, my pulse racing. But I knew, that whatever it was that haunted this house, it wasn't over. It hadn't finished with me yet. The room grew colder still, and I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself for warmth. The screams from upstairs had stopped, but now I could hear something else. Whispers, low and guttural, emanating from the walls themselves. The house was alive. It was aware of me, and I could feel it closing in. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But even as I made my way toward the door again, the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. And then, for a brief moment, I felt it, a cold, icy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, oppressive darkness. And the whispers, always the whispers. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 7. I could feel it, watching me, the moment I stepped away from the kitchen door. My breath came in shallow, quick bursts, each one echoing in the empty house. The air around me seemed thicker, as though the very atmosphere was conspiring to keep me here, in this wretched place. I didn't care anymore. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the door handle. I needed to escape. I needed to get out before it happened again. I pushed, but the door still wouldn't open. Locked. No. I muttered under my breath, panic creeping up my throat. I turned to the window, but the glass was cold to the touch, the view outside obscured by shadows, like the darkness itself was swallowing the world whole. Behind me, I could hear it, the faint creaking of the floorboards upstairs, as though someone was pacing back and forth. I wasn't imagining it. I could feel the presence moving, circling above me. The house had become a prison, and I was the only one left in it, alone with whatever was hunting me. I backed away from the door, my pulse thudding in my temples. The heavy, oppressive silence surrounded me, making my skin prickle. Suddenly, the sound of something scraping against the floor broke the stillness. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, the rhythmic scrape of nails against wood, as if something, or someone, was dragging itself across the floor above me. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. No movement, no figure, just the dull glow of moonlight, seeping through the cracked curtains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. It had to be the house settling. It had to be. But then, the unmistakable sound of someone, breathing, echoed from the stairwell. I froze. The breath was shallow, ragged, as if struggling to draw in air. My stomach twisted, nausea creeping up my throat. I had to move. I had to do something. But every instinct told me not to go upstairs. Whatever was up there, I knew, was no longer human. I turned away from the door and walked toward the narrow hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet with every step, as though the house itself was groaning in protest. But it wasn't the house I was worried about. It was what was inside it. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls old and cracked, faded wallpaper peeling in places. The silence was almost suffocating. I knew what I had to do. I had to confront it. I couldn't keep running. The stairs were in front of me now, the narrow, creaky staircase leading up into the darkness. I could hear the dragging noise again, closer this time. It was just at the top of the stairs. Whatever it was waiting. I took a deep breath and began to climb. Each step groaned beneath me, louder and louder as I ascended. The house seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, vibrating under my feet. At the top, the shadows pressed in from all sides. The hallway was longer than I remembered. A door at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar, its creaking hinges beckoning me toward it like a whisper in the wind. But there was another sound, a scratching, like fingernails on a chalkboard, coming from the room next door. I couldn't tell if I was hallucinating or if it was real, but it was too late to turn back now. I pushed open the door to the room at the end of the hall, the one with the faintest sliver of light spilling from its cracked window. The room was empty, save for a small wooden desk in the corner. Papers were scattered across the desk, their edges frayed, yellowed with age. But it wasn't the papers that caught my attention. It was the book, an old leather-bound journal, lying open in the middle of the desk. I walked toward it, every muscle in my body tense, as if I were walking into the very heart of the storm. The journal seemed to call to me, its pages flipping in the breeze as if they were alive. As I reached down and opened the cover, a chill ran down my spine. The pages were filled with strange symbols, scrawled in a hurried, frantic hand. I couldn't read most of it, but some words were unmistakable, names, dates, curses. The same name kept appearing, Jacob Willoughby, the man who had built this house, the man who had cursed it. And then one sentence stood out, written in thick, dark ink. The door's open. The thing waits. Before I could process it, a sound, a thump, came from the other side of the room. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. My breath caught as I saw the door swing open slowly, inch by inch, without anyone touching it. A shadow moved into the room, just at the edge of my vision. I turned back to the journal, my mind racing. I had to understand what was happening. I had to find out how to stop it. But as I stared at the words, the letters began to blur and shift, as though they were alive, twisting in front of me. And then the door slammed shut. The darkness swallowed the room whole. I could hear the scraping sound again, closer, louder now, and the unmistakable feeling of eyes upon me, studying me. It was the house. It was alive, and it was feeding. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. The cold touch was enough to send me into a blind panic. I turned and screamed, but nothing was there, just the darkness. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 8. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, in that suffocating dark. The air felt like it was pressing in on me, as though the house itself was breathing, moving, watching. It wasn't until the sounds faded, the scraping, the dragging, the whispering, that I was able to force myself to take a step back. I had to leave. That was the only thought in my mind. I turned toward the door, heart pounding in my chest, my body on edge, ready to bolt. But as I reached for the knob, I froze. The house groaned. The floor beneath my feet trembled. The air shifted. There was something else. Something alive. I spun around, eyes wide in panic. The journal, the one I had left open on the desk, was no longer there. A wave of terror surged through me, but I quickly stifled it. Stay calm, I told myself. It's just a trick of the light. The house was old, settling. That's all. Just an old, settling house. But as I walked toward the desk, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway to the hallway. A tall silhouette, barely visible in the shadows, with a presence so chilling, so unnatural, that my breath caught in my throat. I froze. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but I couldn't. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. Then it stepped forward. I stumbled back, my body shaking, my heart thundering against my ribs as I tripped over the edge of the desk. The chair fell over with a loud crash, but I couldn't even hear it. I could only hear my own panicked breathing and the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming closer. I backed up toward the corner of the room, my legs buckling beneath me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. It was a man, the figure, tall and thin, wearing old-fashioned clothes, his face shadowed by the dim light. His movements were unnaturally slow, deliberate, like he was savoring every step toward me. Jacob Willoughby, I whispered, the name from the journal coming unbidden to my lips. The figure's eyes, black, empty, glinted in the darkness. It's him, the thought struck me with a sickening realization. The original owner, the one who had done this, the one who had invited it all in. He stopped a few feet away from me, his face still hidden, just beyond the reach of the pale moonlight streaming through the window. Then came the whisper. The voice was low, guttural, like the sound of gravel scraping together, but unmistakable. You shouldn't have come here. His words seemed to echo around me, like the house itself was speaking. My chest tightened, my breathing shallow. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air thick with an icy chill that seemed to claw at my skin. My hands, frozen at my sides, couldn't even lift to defend myself. His voice, his presence, was overwhelming. "You will never leave," he whispered, his voice laced with a dark promise. "This place is mine. You are mine." I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I felt paralyzed. Every muscle in my body refused to obey me. This was at the end. But then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure vanished. 1 second, he was there. The next, nothing. The room was silent. Still, the only sound was my own frenzied breath, the pounding of my heart ringing in my ears. I tried to move, to shake off the paralysis, but my limbs felt like lead. My body was sluggish, unresponsive. And then I felt it, something cold, icy cold, pressed against my back, just below my shoulder blades. I whirled around, but there was nothing. Nothing except the crushing weight of darkness pressing in from all sides. The door. I needed to get to the door. I stumbled toward it, but the temperature continued to drop until the very air around me felt like I was suffocating. I could feel the presence again, that oppressive weight, the thing that haunted this house. It was still here. It was watching, waiting. I gripped the door handle, pulling with all my might, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, jammed, trapped. And then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't just the wind. It was him. I screamed, a primal, guttural sound that tore from my throat. But no one could hear me. No one was coming. And in that moment I knew I would never leave this house. Not alive. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 9. I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. The darkness inside the house had swallowed me whole, and time had lost all meaning. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, suffocating me, filling my lungs with the cold dampness of something ancient. I had to leave. The door, still stubbornly locked, mocked me. I pulled harder, desperation clawing at my insides, but it refused to budge. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the handle, my mind racing. How could I get out? The back door? No. The attic. It had to be the attic. I turned away from the door and stumbled toward the stairs, each step an effort, as though the very house was pushing against me, pulling me back. The whispers had returned, louder now, but they weren't just in my head. They were all around me, coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the corners of the room. "Jacob Willoughby," the voice called out. "You shouldn't have come here." I didn't stop. I couldn't. The attic was my only hope, my only escape. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, the noise echoing in the silence. The door to the attic was at the top of the stairs, but as I reached for the handle, I felt the air grow colder, the temperature dropping with a sharp bite. The door was already open. It wasn't like I had left it. I was sure of that. I would have remembered. It was as if the house itself had invited me in, luring me closer. I stepped into the attic, and the smell hit me: dust, decay, and something else. A faint, nauseating stench, like rotting wood, lingered in the air. It was so thick I could taste it, the bitter, metallic tang in the back of my throat. And then I saw it, the journal. The journal I had left downstairs, sitting on the old wooden table in the center of the attic. The pages were open, fluttering as if the wind had been blowing through them, but the windows were closed. Still, there was a breeze, a chill that seemed to breathe from the very walls. I took a hesitant step toward it, my mind screaming for me to turn and run. But my legs moved on their own, drawing me closer to the table. The journal called to me. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and as I touched the leather cover, a shock of cold shot through me. It was as though the book had a life of its own, a pulse, a heartbeat. I pulled my hand back, startled, but the compulsion to open it was too strong. I couldn't fight it. Slowly, I opened the book to the last page I had read, my eyes scanning the words, but they didn't make sense. The ink was smeared as though something had been wiped across it, and the sentences twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. But then, the words started to shift. They weren't just ink on paper. They were alive. I blinked, and the writing changed, forming new sentences, new names. Names that I recognized. Jacob Willoughby, I whispered. The letters on the page began to bleed, turning into something dark, something viscous, like ink mixed with blood. And then I saw it, a figure in the corner of the room. It was him, Jacob Willoughby. But this time, he wasn't just a shadow. He was solid, standing tall, his face twisted into an expression of hunger, of madness. His eyes were dark voids, endless and consuming. "You shouldn't have opened it," he growled, his voice like gravel scraping together. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my heart hammering in my rib cage. My legs gave out, and I sank to my knees, unable to look away. The figure took a slow step toward me, its movements unnatural, like it was dragging itself from the very fabric of reality. "No," I whispered. "No, please." But the words caught in my throat as the room grew darker, colder. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, the floor beneath me warping and twisting like a living thing. He was coming closer, closer. I could feel his presence, his cold, suffocating aura wrapping around me like a vice. I couldn't escape. The house wouldn't let me. Suddenly, the figure lunged. I screamed, a primal sound that echoed through the attic, but it was drowned out by the deafening silence that followed. The world around me spun, and for a brief moment, I thought I was falling into some endless abyss. But then, everything went still. I opened my eyes. The attic was empty. The journal was gone. I was alone. At least, that's what I thought. But then, I heard the footsteps again. The heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from above. I wasn't alone. I was never alone. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I knew that now. Whatever had been haunting me, whatever was alive in that place, was not going to let me leave. I had to get out, now. I scrambled to my feet, my head spinning, my legs weak, and rushed toward the stairs. But as I descended, the house seemed to shift, the walls groaning, the floorboards creaking in protest beneath my weight. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. It was like the house was alive, angry, and it was following me, chasing me. The footsteps, heavy and deliberate, were getting closer. Asterisk, no, no, no. Asterisk. I reached the bottom of the stairs and bolted for the front door, but when I pulled at the handle, it refused to open. The door was stuck, as if something was holding it shut, keeping me inside. I screamed, yanking on the door, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers slipped, sweaty from the panic coursing through me. My heart raced, my breath shallow, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. I needed to get out, and then the air grew colder, impossibly cold, until I could see my breath in front of me. The house was breathing. It was breathing. The oppressive weight of it pressed in on me, suffocating me. I felt a presence behind me, a shift in the air, and I turned. The man, Jacob Willoughby. But this time, he wasn't in the corner. He wasn't standing still. He was moving toward me, slowly, his long, eerie steps bringing him closer, closer. His face was blank, hollow eyes, mouth twisted in an expression of something ancient, something cruel. No, no, stay away from me, I begged, my voice shaking. But he didn't stop. He didn't even acknowledge me. I turned back to the door, desperately trying to force it open again, pulling and pushing until my palms were raw. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat an urgent call for escape. But the door was still stuck. The figure was closer now, and I could hear his breathing. Slow, deliberate. I turned back once more, my face pale with terror. He was right behind me, inches away. I could feel his presence, like an icy hand brushing against my neck. I told you, he rasped, his voice a whisper that scraped against my skin. You shouldn't have come here. This place, it owns you now. His cold breath brushed my ear, and I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only feel the weight of his gaze, the suffocating presence of something far older than the house itself. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped, until I heard it. The faintest sound of something shifting, moving beneath the floorboards. A scraping noise, like claws on wood, scraping, scraping. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I could feel the vibrations from below, traveling up through the house. Something was coming. Something was rising. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness as I fell, plummeting downward. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I would hit the ground or if I was just falling endlessly into the house's depths. All I knew was that the air was thick and the cold, it was unbearable. The darkness closed in on me, suffocating me. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the house. At least, not the house I recognized. The place around me felt wrong, distant, cold, like I had been transported somewhere else entirely. I was lying on a hard, uneven surface, the air thick with dust and decay. The familiar creaks of the house were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as though the weight of the darkness was pressing down on me. My hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet, and when I looked around, panic surged in my chest. I wasn't in the attic. I wasn't in any room I had ever seen before. The walls were cracked, jagged, and covered in old, peeling wallpaper that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The ceiling was low, and the floor was made of rough stone. It looked like a basement, except it wasn't. There was no door, no windows, no way out. Just walls. And in the distance, a figure stood, motionless. It was the same man, Jacob Willoughby, but this time, his form was different. There was something distorted about him, something wrong. His body seemed to shimmer, flickering in and out of existence, like a fading image. I swallowed hard, but the lump in my throat refused to go away. I don't understand, I whispered, my voice hoarse, unsure whether I was even speaking to him or to the void around me. What is this? Where am I? Jacob didn't answer. He didn't move. He simply stood there, like a silent sentinel in the shadows, watching me with his dark, empty eyes. Suddenly, I felt it again, the cold, the dread, the pressure on my chest, as though something were pulling at me from within the walls. The air thickened. The silence grew heavier, and I began to hear faint whispers, so quiet at first that I thought I was imagining them, but they grew louder until they surrounded me. "Jacob Willoughby?" I spun around, my heart racing. The voice echoed from every corner, from the floor, from the ceiling. "Jacob Willoughby." The whispers seemed to wrap around me, smothering me, until I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and then, without warning, the floor beneath my feet began to tremble. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration, but it grew stronger until the entire room was shaking. My legs buckled beneath me, and I had to grab onto the walls to steady myself. The figure moved then, stepping toward me slowly. His presence was suffocating, overwhelming, and I felt an almost uncontrollable urge to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, and then with a sickening crack, the ground beneath me split open. I screamed as I fell, my body hurtling downward, plummeting through endless darkness. I couldn't see anything, just a sensation of falling, the sound of my own breath filling my ears. The fall felt endless, and my mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no making sense of it. There was no escape, no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fall stopped. I landed with a thud, the air knocked out of my lungs. I gasped for breath, my body aching, my head spinning. When I opened my eyes again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The room was different now. I was in a large, dimly lit space, the floor made of old, warped wood. The walls were lined with shelves, but the shelves weren't filled with books. They were filled with something else, something far darker. The shelves were lined with jars. Each jar contained something grotesque. Some were filled with liquid, others with dry, shriveled remains. Eyes, fingers, teeth, fragments of bone. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but beneath it, there was something worse, something faint, something wrong. I could feel it again, the presence, the heavy, suffocating presence of something malevolent, something ancient. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it had been here long before me. I slowly turned my head, and there he was again, Jacob Willoughby. He was standing in the doorway now, his form more solid, more real. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them, something that wasn't there before. A flash of satisfaction. "I told you," he murmured, his voice low, dripping with malice. "You never leave this place." And that was when I realized I wasn't just trapped in the house. I was trapped in his world. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 12. The realization hit me like a wave, cold and unforgiving. I wasn't just trapped in the house. I was trapped in something else. Something far beyond the crumbling walls and peeling wallpaper. It was a nightmare, one that had no end, no escape. And Jacob Willoughby, he wasn't just some shadow of the past. He was the architect of this horror. He had brought me here. The room seemed to pulse with his presence, every inch of space suffocating under the weight of the unseen. I could feel the walls closing in on me, feel the sinister energy suffusing every inch of the air. The jars on the shelves seemed to watch me, their grotesque contents flickering in the dim light. I could swear the eyes inside the jars followed me, their lids twitching as if they were alive. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest, but Jacob didn't move. He just stood there, his figure growing more solid, more real with every passing second. His eyes glinted with a quiet satisfaction, as though he had won, as though I was just another piece of his collection. "You can try to run," he said, his voice quiet but laced with an unsettling calm. "But there's nowhere to go. No way out. Not anymore." I didn't have to ask what he meant. The air around me thickened, the pressure building until I could barely breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in, squeezing the life out of me. Every instinct told me to run, to find an escape, but I knew it was pointless. The house had already claimed me. It had claimed all of us. "Why?" I whispered. my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question, his gaze never leaving mine. "It's not what I want," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's what the house wants, what it's always wanted. To feed." The word hung in the air, an unsettling truth that sent chills down my spine. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It had been waiting, pulling people in, trapping them, feeding on their fear, their souls. And I was its latest meal. I backed away from him, my mind racing for a way out, any way to escape this hellish reality. But as I turned to flee, the ground beneath me cracked open again. This time, it was no illusion. The floor was really splitting apart, revealing a yawning black abyss beneath me. I stumbled, almost losing my balance as I tried to steady myself, but the house wouldn't let me go. The air turned to ice, biting into my skin, and I heard it, the whispering again. The walls groaned in response, as if they were alive, watching, waiting. The jars on the shelves began to shake, rattling violently. The eyes inside flickered, the lids opening one by one. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. It was like they were calling to me, beckoning me closer, urging me to come to the darkness. I felt the air shift behind me, and I turned just in time to see Jacob's figure flicker, the edges of his form shimmering like a broken reflection in a cracked mirror. "You can't leave," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "Not this time." Before I could react, a sharp, icy pain shot through my chest, and I gasped, my hands flying to the spot where the pain was centered. My vision blurred as the room around me tilted, spinning out of control. My legs buckled beneath me, and I fell to the ground, the cold stone floor scraping against my skin. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, surrounding me, drowning out everything else. They weren't just in my head. They were coming from everywhere. The walls, the jars, the very air. The house was speaking to me. I could barely focus, my body shaking uncontrollably, but I managed to push myself to my feet again. The darkness seemed to reach for me, tendrils of shadow slithering across the floor, creeping up my legs, pulling me back toward the opening in the ground. But just as I thought I was about to be swallowed whole, I heard it, a loud, sudden crash. The sound of something shattering, something breaking through the suffocating darkness. And in that instant, I realized what it was. The door, the front door had opened. Without thinking, I bolted toward it. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything else. I just had to get out. I ran, my breath ragged, my heart pounding as I crossed the threshold. And then, just as I reached the doorway, I felt it, the sharp, unbearable pull, as though the house itself was trying to drag me back inside. But I didn't go back. I ran into the night, into the cold, into the safety of the world beyond the house. And for the first time since I had arrived, I breathed. But as I stumbled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't finished with me yet. I could still hear it, the whispers, just faintly in the distance, like a shadow hanging just behind me, always lurking. And I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the house would find me again. It was only a matter of time. Let me know if you want to dive deeper into any part of the story. Story 2. I had always dreamed of starting fresh, far away from the chaos of my old life. After the divorce, I needed a place to clear my head, something simple, away from the noise, where I could just breathe again. So, when I found the old house on the edge of town, I didn't hesitate. The rent was cheap, and the space was enough for me to get comfortable in. I figured it would be just what I needed. The house wasn't much to look at from the outside, a 2-story building, its paint chipped and faded from years of neglect. The yard was overgrown with weeds, but nothing too alarming. In fact, the house almost looked like something out of an old movie, quiet and forgotten. As I walked through the front door, I was greeted by a faint smell of dust and something earthy, not unpleasant, just a little strange. The creaking floorboards echoed under my feet as I made my way through the hallway. The place felt empty, like it was waiting for something. Maybe it was just a silence, no bustling neighbors or loud traffic outside. But something about it made me uneasy. I pushed that feeling aside. I was used to being alone, and the idea of living without distractions was comforting, even if the house was a little older than I expected. I spent the first few days unpacking and settling in. The kitchen was small but functional. The living room had an old fireplace, and I could already imagine myself curled up with a book in the evenings. The upstairs had 2 bedrooms, one for me and one for whatever I decided to turn into an office or guest room. The bathroom had a bathtub that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a while, but nothing that a good scrub couldn't fix. I went into town to get some groceries, and when I returned, I met Mrs. Cunningham. She was a neighbor from across the street, probably in her late 70s, with short gray hair and a wide smile. She seemed eager to introduce herself. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her voice warm but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "It's nice to see someone new in that house. Not many people stay long." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She glanced over at the house with a strange expression, almost like she was trying to decide whether or not to say something. "Oh, nothing to worry about. It's just, well, people have said strange things about that place over the years. Last tenant, young guy, he lasted a few weeks, then ran out of there in the middle of the night, babbling about hearing things. Footsteps, whispers. Claimed the place was cursed." I chuckled awkwardly, not sure how to respond. Mrs. Cunningham seemed like a nice lady, but I wasn't one to believe in curses or ghost stories. I smiled and nodded, hoping to steer the conversation to safer territory. "I'm sure it's just an old house settling. Nothing to worry about." She gave a soft, knowing smile. "Maybe, but just be careful. Old houses have a way of showing their true colors after a while." She lingered for a moment longer, then wished me well before walking back to her house. I stood there for a moment, staring at my new home. I wasn't one to let stories get to me, especially when I had a life to rebuild. Still, there was something unsettling about the house, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I shrugged it off. I wasn't going to let my imagination run wild. That night, I settled into bed, the house creaking and groaning as it always did. I turned off the lights and pulled the blanket around me, listening to the sounds of the night. The rustling of leaves outside, the occasional car passing by. Nothing out of the ordinary, but then I heard it, a slow, steady thud, like something heavy being dragged across the floor upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly dismissed it. The house was old. It was just the settling noises, the pipes, the house shifting. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to get back to sleep. The thudding stopped, but the silence that followed felt even worse, as if the house was holding its breath. I closed my eyes and drifted off, the feeling of unease still lingering in the air. Would you like me to continue with the next chapter? The following days were a blur of unpacking boxes and getting used to the new rhythm of life. I started working from home, setting up my makeshift office in the smaller room upstairs. The house seemed to settle into its usual creaks and groans. I thought maybe Mrs. Cunningham's strange warnings had been exaggerated. Old houses make noises. There's no mystery to it, right? But that night, things felt different. I was sitting on the couch, eating a quick dinner, when I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to echo through the floorboards. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. I looked around the room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. It wasn't the usual creaks. It was more distinct, more intentional. I sat still, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The house was old. The floors were uneven. A lot of the time, the wind outside could make things sound worse than they were. But the footsteps continued, step, pause, step, coming from upstairs. I hesitated, then set my plate down and stood up, creeping toward the stairs. The house was quiet again, eerily so, except for the faint sound of the wind against the windows. I reached the bottom of the stairs and looked up into the darkness above. "Hello," I called out, my voice feeling small in the stillness. No response, just a thick, heavy silence. I sighed and turned back to my dinner, chalking it up to my imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the house, just to get a better feel for the place. The creaking floors didn't bother me much anymore. I was starting to get used to the house's quirks. But the more I explored, the more I noticed things that seemed off. Upstairs, the hallway was narrow and lined with old wallpaper that was peeling at the edges. The door to the larger bedroom was cracked open, as though someone had been inside recently. But I was the only one there. The bed in that room was unmade, the sheets tangled as though someone had hastily gotten up. The room was also colder than the rest of the house, an odd chill that made me pull my sweater tighter around me. I couldn't help but feel a slight unease, but I brushed it off. The house was old. Of course, there would be some strange things. Maybe the previous tenants hadn't cared much about cleanliness or maintenance. As I was about to leave the room, I noticed something on the floor near the bed, a small, leather-bound notebook. I picked it up, dusting it off, and opened it to the first page. It was a diary. The handwriting was messy, hurried, almost frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry to document something. I skimmed through the pages, reading snippets of sentences about disturbing dreams, hearing whispers in the dark, and strange rituals performed in the house. I hear them again, footsteps at night. The house is changing. It's not just old, it's alive. I've seen things in the shadows. I can't explain them, but they're there. I know they're watching. It's the house. It's the curse. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped through more pages. The entries grew more erratic, mentioning names I didn't recognize and referring to some kind of ritual that needed to be performed to keep them at bay. Whoever had lived here before had been terrified. But why? The doorbell rang suddenly, making me jump. I shoved the diary back into the drawer and rushed downstairs to answer the door. It was Mrs. Cunningham again. "You didn't happen to find an old journal, did you?" she asked, her voice cautious. I froze. Yeah, I did. Why?" She looked around before leaning in closer, lowering her voice. "I thought you might. It's been there for years. The last tenant, he didn't leave it behind on purpose." "What do you mean?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. She sighed, looking over her shoulder as if to make sure no one was watching. "The man who lived here before you, he was a bit obsessed with the occult, kept to himself mostly, but I'd hear him talking to himself sometimes, like he was trying to banish something. He'd mumble words in a language I couldn't understand. People said he was crazy, but there were whispers about him doing some kind of ritual. That's when things started getting strange." "Strange?" I pressed, my heart racing. She nodded, her eyes wide. The house started changing. It wasn't just old creaks and groans anymore. People heard footsteps, heavy ones, like something was walking around. And then there were those strange cold spots. People started feeling watched. The house, it wasn't just a house anymore. It was something else. I swallowed hard. "And what happened to him?" Mrs. Cunningham shook her head slowly. "He left. In the middle of the night. Ran out of here. Screaming about curses and shadows. Haven't seen him since." I stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. "Why didn't you tell me this before I moved in?" She gave me a long, unreadable look. "You'll figure it out. Everyone who's lived here has. Just don't say I didn't warn you." She turned and walked away without another word. As I stood there, staring at the house, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it all. The house was old, Sure, but could it really be cursed? Could someone's obsession with the occult have left some kind of mark? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, the footsteps started again, but this time they were closer. Would you like to continue to Chapter 3? The next few days blurred into one another, each feeling heavier than the last. The house, once just a quiet old building, now felt like something more, a presence I couldn't escape. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light, seemed to remind me that I wasn't alone. At first, I tried to ignore it all. The footsteps, the cold spots, the strange shadows that flickered in the corners of my eyes. But there was no escaping it. The house was watching, listening, waiting for something. It was a Tuesday night when the voices started. I had just finished a long day of work and decided to take a walk around the house to clear my head. It had become a bit of a routine, an attempt to escape the suffocating feeling that had settled over me. I walked from room to room, inspecting everything, as if doing so would somehow reassure me that nothing was out of place. But that night, something was different. I was standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door to the larger bedroom, when I heard it, a faint whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe the house settling again, but as I stood there, straining to hear, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a voice, but it was too muffled, too distant to make out the words. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I took a step forward, then another, inching closer to the door. The voice seemed to shift, as though it were moving, circling me, but still just out of reach. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the windows. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for the voice to reveal itself. But it didn't. Instead, I heard a thump, followed by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. I whirled around, but there was nothing in the room but dust and shadows. The voice was gone, and the house was silent again. I backed away, feeling my pulse race. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was imagining things. I closed the door and tried to calm myself, but the unease in my chest refused to go away. That night, the footsteps returned. They were heavier now, almost like boots stomping down the hall. But this time, they weren't upstairs. They were right outside my bedroom door. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, listening to the sound of someone walking through the hallway. It wasn't the house settling. This was something else. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I kept on the nightstand. My hand shook as I clicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I moved cautiously down the hall, the sound of footsteps echoing in the silence, leading me to the source of the noise. I reached the stairs, my breath coming in short gasps. The house was still, eerily still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. And then I heard it again, a voice. This time, it was clearer, more defined. Leave. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. I swung the flashlight around, but there was no one there. Leave. The voice repeated, louder now, almost a growl. It seemed to be coming from the shadows themselves, wrapping around me like a cold, invisible hand. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something that wasn't quite real. The air grew colder still, and the whispers turned into murmurs, like a crowd gathering just out of sight. I could feel their eyes on me, but when I looked around, there was nothing, just the house silent waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I sank to the floor, gasping for air, my mind racing. I had to leave, but the thought of leaving, of walking away from everything I had built for myself, filled me with a deep sense of dread. The house, whatever it was, wasn't going to let me go that easily. I sat there, shivering on the floor, the whispers still echoing in my mind. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay here, but I knew one thing. I couldn't leave without finding out what was really going on. There was something in this house, something ancient, something dark, and it was calling to me. Would you like to proceed to Chapter 4? The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of dread. Every little noise in the house seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder that something was lurking just beyond my sight. I couldn't focus on my work. The whispers were still there, echoing in my mind, growing louder with each passing hour. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know what was happening. The old journal was the only clue I had, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I hadn't fully examined it. It was filled with erratic scribbles and strange drawings, things I couldn't understand. Whoever had written it had clearly been terrified of something, maybe of the house itself. That night, I decided to take a closer look. I brought the journal back into the small room upstairs, where I had been sleeping, and set it down on the desk. The faint light from the lamp cast long shadows across the pages, making the scribbled words and symbols seem alive. I turned to the first entry and began to read. It was dated several years ago, but the words felt oddly familiar. I've seen them again. They're here in the house. The footsteps, the whispers. I don't know how much longer I can stay. I've been doing the rituals, but I don't think it's enough. I feel them closing in every night, getting closer. The house is alive. It's hungry. The handwriting grew more erratic as I continued to read, growing increasingly frantic. I flipped through the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. There were descriptions of rituals, strange incantations, symbols drawn hastily on the walls, and mentions of an old man who had lived in the house long before the previous tenant. This man, it seemed, had been obsessed with the occult and had opened some kind of door, a doorway to something dark and ancient. One entry stood out in particular, the words almost jumping off the page. They came to me last night. I thought they were just shadows, but they were real. Cold, dead eyes, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I saw them standing in the doorway, just watching me. The old man warned me, but I didn't listen. Now, I'm trapped. The house's history was clearer now. The man had been obsessed with the supernatural, convinced that the house held some kind of power. He had been performing rituals, trying to open a doorway to another world, something beyond our understanding. But instead of controlling whatever he had summoned, he had become its prisoner. The more I read, the more I realized how little I knew about the house I was living in. It wasn't just an old building. It was something more, something cursed. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. I had to know more. What had happened to the man? Was he the one who had left in the middle of the night, running out screaming about curses? Had he been driven mad by the very thing he had called into the house? I knew I had to find out, but I was terrified. There was something in the house, something that didn't want to be discovered. The cold spots, the whispers, the footsteps, they weren't just coincidences. The house was alive, and it was watching me, just as it had watched the man before me. I sat there, frozen, the journal resting in my lap, the weight of it all pressed down on me, and I could feel the house growing colder around me. The floorboards groaned beneath me as if something was moving, something unseen. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. And then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the house, drawing closer and closer. I backed away from the desk, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a chill creeping up my spine. I had to go. I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed the journal, shoved it into my bag, and ran toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, The door slammed shut, as though something invisible was holding it in place. I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. My heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, now right outside the door. "Leave!" The voice whispered again, a cold, menacing growl. The same voice I had heard before. The handle rattled, the wood creaking under the pressure. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, feeling the weight of something watching me. Something ancient, something hungry. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound of footsteps stopped. The door creaked open on its own, as though inviting me to step into the dark. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't know what I was running from, whether it was the house, or the thing that lived inside it, or the truth I was too scared to face. But I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't live in this house. Trapped by the whispers, the footsteps, the cold. As I stumbled down the stairs, I heard it again, the sound of someone walking behind me, just out of sight. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I grabbed my coat, my bag, and rushed for the front door. The air outside felt like a release, a breath of fresh air after being suffocated in the house's grip. But as I stood on the porch, the house looming behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still inside, watching, waiting, and that's when I heard it. The whisper, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "Leave now. Would you like to continue with Chapter 5? I didn't sleep that night. The darkness outside was too heavy, too oppressive. It felt like the house was still with me, its presence lingering in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I could still hear the whispers, echoing in my mind, pulling me back to the house, to the nightmare I had just escaped. I didn't want to go back. I told myself I couldn't, but something inside me refused to let go. The house held answers, answers I had to find, no matter how terrifying they were. I had to know what had really happened to the previous tenants, what had driven them away, and, most of all, I had to understand what the house wanted from me. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the local library. I hadn't planned on coming here, but something had drawn me to it, something pushing me to dig deeper into the history of the house. I walked inside, greeted by the smell of old books and dust. The library was quiet, the air still, but there was a sense of urgency in my chest that I couldn't shake. I went straight to the archives, where they kept local history records. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I hoped I would find something, anything, that could explain what was happening to me. I spent hours sifting through old newspapers, town records, and personal journals. There were mentions of strange disappearances, of people leaving town suddenly, of odd occurrences surrounding the house. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me that something had always been off about the place. Then, buried in a dusty corner of one of the journals, I found it. The name of the original owner, Samuel Whitaker. I had never heard the name before, but when I read it, something in me stirred. There was a connection I couldn't explain, a feeling that I had stumbled onto something important. Samuel Whitaker had been a man of wealth and influence, or so the records claimed, but his personal life had been shrouded in mystery. He had lived in the house for decades, always reclusive, always strange. There were rumors that he had been a practitioner of the occult, that he had dabbled in rituals meant to unlock doors to other worlds. But the records were vague, and no one knew for sure what he had been doing in the house, locked away from the rest of the town. What struck me as particularly disturbing were the mentions of his journals, journals that no one had ever been able to find. According to a local historian, Whitaker had written extensively about his experiments with the supernatural, recording his attempts to communicate with spirits and open gateways to another realm. It seemed that he had become obsessed, losing touch with reality, until one day, he simply vanished without a trace. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I had found the answers I had been searching for, but they only raised more questions. Whitaker's obsession with the occult, his strange rituals. Could that be what had cursed the house? Had he opened a door that should have remained closed? The house was still a mystery, But now I had a name, a history to follow. I had to learn more. But every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness. When I returned to the house that evening, I knew I couldn't stop. I had to finish what I had started. But as soon as I walked through the front door, I felt the weight of the house pressed down on me. It was different now, darker, more oppressive. The whispers were louder, more urgent. I dropped my bag by the door and made my way upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I needed to keep moving forward. I entered the room where I had found the journal earlier. The desk was exactly as I had left it, the journal resting on top. But as I picked it up, something caught my eye, a new entry, scrawled in frantic handwriting, almost illegible. "Help me." I froze. My blood ran cold as I scanned the words. The handwriting was wild, desperate. I can hear them. The footsteps, the voices. They're closing in. The door is open and I can't stop it. They won't leave me alone. Please help me. The entry ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. My hands trembled as I set the journal down. What had happened to the man who had written these words? Had he, too, been driven mad by the same forces that haunted me? As I sat there, my thoughts racing, I heard it again, the footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. I stood up, my heart pounding. It couldn't be. It couldn't be happening again. I slowly made my way toward the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder with each movement, the house growing more alive, more aware of my presence. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to the larger bedroom was open, the faintest flicker of light coming from inside. But it wasn't the light from the lamp I had left on earlier. No, this light was different. It was unnatural, cold, flickering like a dying flame. I took a step forward, my pulse racing. The footsteps had stopped, but the house was far from silent. There was something else now, a soft, low murmuring, like a chant, coming from inside the room. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was in that room wasn't going to let me leave without a fight. Shall we move forward to Chapter 6? I stood at the threshold of the room, paralyzed. The murmuring voices that filled the air were unlike anything I had ever heard. Low, guttural sounds that seemed to crawl under my skin, curling into my thoughts. I felt the cold from within the room seep out, wrapping around me like an icy grip. It was the same kind of cold I had felt when the door slammed shut earlier, the kind of cold that made my bones ache. For a moment, I considered turning and running. I could leave. I could just walk away from this nightmare and never look back. But something inside me, something darker, something driven by the need for answers, held me in place. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorframe. It creaked as I pushed it open, the sound like a warning. The room beyond was bathed in an eerie, flickering light. It wasn't from the lamp I had left on. This light seemed to come from nowhere, pulsating with a life of its own. The air in the room was thick, like the atmosphere before a storm. A sense of dread hung heavy in the air, making every breath feel like a struggle. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the symbols. They were scrawled all over the walls. Strange, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and shift as my eyes moved over them. Some of them were drawn in dark ink, others in what looked like charcoal, smudged and faded with time. At first, I couldn't make sense of them, but then I realized something terrifying. They were the same symbols I had seen in the journal, the same ones that Samuel Whitaker had used in his rituals. My heart skipped a beat, but it wasn't just the symbols that caught my attention. It was the center of the room. In the very middle on the floor, there was a large, ornate rug. It was faded and torn, but there was something odd about it, something out of place. At first, I thought it was just the wear and tear of age, but as I stepped closer, I could see it. There was something beneath the rug, something that didn't belong. I crouched down, my fingers trembling as I lifted the edge of the rug. Underneath was a trapdoor, A trapdoor. It was made of dark wood, worn with age, but it was unmistakable. I had seen enough in the journal to know what it was. A doorway, a gateway, something Samuel Whitaker had used in his rituals. The murmuring grew louder, more insistent, like an unholy chant that filled my head, pushing me toward the door. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but I could feel the pull, a magnetic force that urged me to open it, to look inside. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave this place, this cursed house, but I couldn't. My hand reached for the handle, cold and smooth under my touch. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but then I opened it. The darkness beneath the trapdoor seemed to swallow the light from the room above. I couldn't see anything, just a deep, black void that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The air was thick with something, an oppressive presence that made it hard to breathe. And then I heard it. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness. They were too familiar, too real. The same footsteps I had heard before, the ones that had followed me through the house. I pulled my hand away from the trapdoor, but it was too late. The murmuring voices grew louder, their urgency rising. The cold air from below rushed up, carrying with it the scent of something old, something decayed. I could feel the pressure in the room building, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, the room went silent. The footsteps stopped. The voices ceased. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. The house felt different now, darker, more alive, like something had shifted, like something had woken up. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, but its face was hidden in the darkness. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. My voice wouldn't come. I took a step back, but the figure remained perfectly still, watching me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I felt the air grow heavier, colder, as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. I could see it more clearly now, and my heart froze in my chest. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, too thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, those eyes, were empty, black pits that seemed to draw me in, consuming everything they touched. Its mouth opened, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth, and I heard it speak. Its voice a low, rasping whisper that scraped against my mind. "You open the door," it said. "Now! You belong to us." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by its gaze, by the cold, suffocating presence that filled the room. It stepped closer, its mouth opening wider, and I felt the coldness of its breath wash over me. It wasn't just air, it was death itself, and it was coming for me. The last thing I remember was the sound of the trapdoor slamming shut, the voices in the house rising again, drowning out everything else. And then darkness. Shall we move forward to chapter 7? When I woke up, I was back in my bed. The covers were tangled around me, and I could feel the cold sweat clinging to my skin. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and uneven. The room was still, eerily so, and for a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream. But the unease in my gut told me otherwise. I looked around the room, the familiar walls, the old furniture, but something was different. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The house was silent, unnaturally so, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. My mind was foggy, and the remnants of the nightmare still clung to me like a shadow. The figure, the trapdoor, the cold breath. I shuddered, pushing myself to my feet. The house felt wrong. It wasn't the creaking floorboards or the faint smell of mildew I had grown used to. It was something else, something deeper, a presence, a weight, that seemed to linger in every room, in every corner. I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been in that room with me hadn't left. It was still here, still watching. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but the clock on the wall told me it was already late afternoon. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was an overwhelming sense of urgency. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave, but as I stood there, ready to grab my things, I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible at first, like the rustling of leaves. But as I listened, it grew louder, clearer. It was coming from downstairs. The footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing in the silence of the house. They moved in a steady rhythm, like they were walking just beneath me, just out of sight. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of something terrible approaching. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs trembled beneath me. I didn't want to go downstairs. I didn't want to face whatever was down there, but I knew I had no choice. If I didn't confront it now, I would never leave. I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking as I pulled it over my shoulders. The footsteps continued, moving closer, closer, until they were right outside my door. I could feel the presence in the hallway, just on the other side of the door, waiting. I took a deep breath, gathering what little courage I had left. Then, with trembling hands, I opened the door. The hallway was empty. The house felt even more oppressive now, like the walls were closing in around me. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. Something was waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I crept down the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The house seemed to groan in protest, as though it were alive, as though it didn't want me to leave. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and that's when I saw it. The trapdoor. It was open. My stomach dropped. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched it since last night. But now, there it was, yawning open, dark and empty, like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I froze, my mind racing. The footsteps were gone now, replaced by an unnatural silence. I couldn't hear anything. No whispers, no murmuring voices, just the deafening quiet of the house. But I could feel it, that same presence, lurking in the shadows. I had to leave. I had to get out of there before whatever was came back. I turned toward the front door, but as I took a step forward, I heard it again, the footsteps. Closer now, too close. They were coming from the basement. I didn't know what had happened to me, or what I had awakened, but I couldn't stay another second. I had to get out. I ran. The house seemed to fight me, its walls shifting, the floors groaning beneath my feet as I ran toward the door. But the closer I got, the harder it became to move. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel the cold pressing against my skin, tightening its grip. When I reached the front door, I yanked it open, stumbling out into the yard. The air outside was fresh and normal, but it felt like a dream. I looked back at the house, the windows staring back at me like dark eyes, empty and watching. I didn't stop. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself further away from the house. I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care if I had nowhere to go. All I wanted was to escape, to get away from that place. But as I ran, I could feel it. Something was still following me. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold. It was all still there, just beyond my reach, always waiting. When I finally reached the edge of town, I stopped, gasping for breath, my chest tight with fear. I looked back at the house one last time, and that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, following me, just at the edge of my hearing. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The house was still miles away, but the presence, the feeling, was still with me. It hadn't left. It was still out there, somewhere waiting. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it, but I do know one thing. Whatever Samuel Whitaker did to that house, whatever door he opened, it hasn't closed, and it will never close. Would you like to proceed with Chapter 8? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even after I left the house behind, the unease stayed with me like a constant companion. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, as if I were being followed. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, and every sound, no matter how faint, felt too close. I tried to tell myself it was just a fear from what had happened, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew better. I couldn't explain what had happened in that house, but I couldn't deny that something had changed. The whispers, the footsteps, the strange, cold feeling that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just in my mind. It was real, and whatever I had woken up, whatever I had opened, it wasn't done with me yet. I tried to put distance between myself and the house, but no matter where I went, it felt like the house was still there, looming over me, its presence hanging like a dark cloud. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every night, the whispers would return, faint but persistent, creeping into my dreams. And every morning, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, knowing that I wasn't alone. I couldn't go back. I couldn't step foot near that house again, but the pull was too strong. It was like a magnetic force, dragging me toward it. A week passed before I could bring myself to go near the house again. I didn't want to. Hell, I shouldn't have, but I had to. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened, what I had unleashed. And most of all, I needed to know if I could stop it. I arrived at the house just after sunset, the sky a dull, gray canvas. The air felt heavy, thick with humidity, like a storm was brewing. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its silhouette sharp against the fading light. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. The windows were like empty eyes, staring back at me, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward. I don't know what I expected to find when I stepped inside. Maybe I thought the house would be different, that it would somehow feel normal, like it had before. But nothing had changed. The creaking floors, the musty smell, the faint hum of electricity, they were all still there, just as they had been when I first moved in. I could feel the weight of the house pressing in on me. It wasn't just the age of the structure. It was something else, something more sinister. I walked through the house, retracing my steps from before. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. It was the same house, yet it felt different. Every room seemed darker, more suffocating. I didn't want to go back to the basement, but I couldn't stop myself. I knew I had to. I needed to know what lay beneath that trapdoor, what Samuel Whitaker had been hiding, and what I had unknowingly unleashed. The basement door was just as I remembered it, old, weathered, and slightly ajar. I could feel the chill coming from below, like the air itself was trying to warn me, to push me away. But I couldn't turn back now. I descended the stairs, each step sending a shiver down my spine. The air down here was thick with dust and decay, but there was something else, a sharp metallic scent, like something had been spilled, something fresh. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The trapdoor was open. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't even touched it since the last time I had seen it. But now, it was wide open, the darkness beneath it like a yawning mouth, waiting to swallow me whole. I felt the cold from below wash over me, sinking deep into my bones. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped closer. I had to know. I had to understand. I peered into the darkness, straining my eyes, but I could see nothing, just the void, the endless black. But then I heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of paper, but it grew louder, clearer. It was no longer a whisper. It was a voice calling my name. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the trapdoor, and the darkness beneath it. "Come closer," the voice whispered, a rasping, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Come and see what you've unleashed." I couldn't move. My body was frozen. My feet rooted to the floor as the voice grew louder, more insistent. It was as though the house itself was alive, pulling me into its depths. And then I saw it. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its form tall and thin, its face hidden in darkness. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. And I knew in that moment that it wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient, something hungry. It took a step toward me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. The air was thick with its presence, suffocating. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said, its words like ice, freezing my soul. "Now you belong to us." My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure moved closer, and I could feel the temperature drop with each step. And then, just as it reached me, everything went black. Shall we continue with Chapter 9? I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the basement. My head throbbed with pain, my limbs heavy and unresponsive, as though I had been asleep for days. My mouth was dry, and I could taste a metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. The basement was still, eerily so, but it felt different now, like the walls themselves were closing in on me, pressing down with an oppressive force. I pushed myself up, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The darkness around me seemed to stretch infinitely, but there were no whispers now, no footsteps, just silence. It took a few moments for my mind to catch up, for the fog to clear. I wasn't sure what had happened, whether I had dreamed it or if it was real, but there was no denying the feeling that something had changed. The air was colder than before, and the house felt alive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I slowly stood up, the floor creaking beneath me, as if the house was groaning under the weight of its own secrets. My head spun for a moment, and I gripped the nearest wall to steady myself. The trapdoor was still open, and I could feel the cold air emanating from the dark space beneath it. The presence that had haunted me, that had followed me, was still here, somewhere in the house. I took a cautious step toward the stairs, but then I stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving. Something was shifting in the house. It wasn't just the creaks of the old building settling. It was something else, something alive. I turned, my heart pounding, my eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to lengthen and twist, crawling across the floor and up the walls. There were no windows in the basement, no way to see the outside world, and yet it felt like the entire house was closing in on me. I could feel the walls pressing against me, the air thick with something suffocating. And then I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible at first, like the scratching of nails on wood. It was coming from behind me, from the dark corner of the basement. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just a dark, empty space. I took a step back, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. The scratching continued, louder now, more insistent. It sounded like something or someone was trying to get out. I took another step back, but my foot caught on something and I stumbled. As I reached out to steady myself, my hand brushed against something cold and damp. I froze, my fingers trembling as I felt the surface beneath my hand. It was a book. I pulled it out from under the dust and debris, my hands shaking as I turned it over. It was old, covered in cracked, peeling leather. The pages inside were yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places, but it was unmistakable. This was the journal of Samuel Whitaker. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages, each one filled with notes and strange symbols. It was difficult to make sense of the writing, but one thing was clear. Samuel Whitaker had been obsessed with something dark, something that I had unwittingly unleashed. The further I read, the more I felt the weight of his words bearing down on me. He spoke of rituals, ancient, forbidden rites that were meant to open a doorway to the other side, a doorway that would allow something to pass through, something that shouldn't be here. I stopped reading when I came across a page with a drawing, an image of the trapdoor, the very one I had seen earlier. But this time, the drawing was different. The trapdoor was surrounded by symbols, intricate and unsettling, like a barrier meant to keep something locked inside. And there, written beneath the drawing, was a single line, asterisk when the door opens. It will never close again. Asterisk. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read those words. The cold that had settled in my bones deepened, and I could feel the presence in the house growing stronger, closer. Whatever had been waiting, whatever had been unleashed, was here. It was coming for me. I slammed the journal shut, but the scratching noise behind me only grew louder. It was coming closer, moving through the shadows, following me. The walls seemed to be vibrating with a low hum, as though the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear that radiated from me. I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay another second in this house, not with whatever had been unleashed lurking in the darkness. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the basement, the cold air biting at my skin as I hurried up the stairs. But as I reached the top of the stairs, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, my hands scrambling to break free, but the grip was unyielding. I kicked and pulled, but it felt like something was dragging me back down, pulling me into the darkness. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. A pale, skeletal hand, its fingers long and bony, gripping my ankle with an unnatural strength. The fingers dug into my flesh, cold and clammy, sending a shock of terror through me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I yanked my leg free, stumbling backward as I managed to break free from its grasp. I ran up the stairs, my heart racing, my legs shaking, until I reached the door. It was locked. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs behind me. I could feel its presence closing in, and I knew it was too late. It was already here. I slammed my shoulder into the door, over and over again, until the wood splintered. Finally, with one last forceful push, the door flew open and I ran. But as I looked back at the house one last time, I saw it. The trapdoor was wide open, and from within it, something was rising. Would you like to continue with Chapter 10? I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that house as possible. My heart thudded painfully against my chest as I dashed through the darkened streets, my breath ragged, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. Away from the house. Away from the thing I had awoken. The further I ran, the more the world around me seemed to warp. The houses, the trees, the streetlights. They all blurred together as if the town itself were shifting, rearranging, like a nightmare taking shape. The cold, biting air filled my lungs, but it wasn't enough to wash away the fear that clung to me like a second skin. I found myself in a part of town I didn't recognize, an old, forgotten part of the neighborhood, where the streets were narrow and the houses crumbled with age. I didn't know how I had ended up here, but something deep inside me told me I had to keep moving. I slowed down eventually, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind racing. I had to get to safety. I had to figure out what had happened. But what could I even do? What could stop the thing that had been released? I stumbled down a street lined with decaying houses, their windows dark, their doors boarded up. Everything felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if I were being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that house was still following me, lurking just out of sight. And then I heard it, a soft, distant sound, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no. The whispering was too distinct. It was a voice, low, cold, almost like a lullaby. I froze, my pulse racing. It was coming from one of the houses, the crumbling house closest to me. I didn't want to go near it. I didn't want to hear whatever it was that was calling to me. But the whisper grew louder, almost as if it were beckoning me, urging me to come closer. I backed away slowly, my body trembling, but my feet seemed to move of their own accord. The pull was too strong. I was being drawn to it, to that house, to the source of the voice. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stepped toward the front door. The air was thick, suffocating. I could almost taste the decay in the air. With trembling hands, I reached for the door, and it creaked open before I even touched the handle. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight, the scent of mildew and dust filling my nose. The air was stale, like the house had been abandoned for years. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from upstairs. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I should turn around. I should leave. But the voice was irresistible, pulling me in, beckoning me upward. I felt like a moth drawn to a flame, unable to stop myself. I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The higher I went, the colder it became. The temperature dropped with each step, until I was shivering uncontrollably, my breath coming out in white clouds. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, dark and narrow. The whispering was louder now, closer. It was coming from the last door on the left. I stepped toward it, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was small, almost suffocating. The walls were lined with old, yellowed wallpaper, and the air was thick with dust. But there, in the center of the room, was a single object that made my blood run cold. It was a chair, a wooden chair worn and ancient, sitting in the middle of the room, facing the corner, and on the floor in front of it, a pile of old, brittle papers, diaries, journals. But there was something more, something dark, something familiar. The whispering was deafening now, swirling around me, echoing in my ears. I reached down, my fingers trembling as I picked up one of the journals. The pages were yellow and brittle, the ink faded with age. But as I flipped through it, my heart stopped. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Samuel Whitaker's. The journal detailed the same dark rituals I had seen in his previous book, the same symbols, the same warnings. But there was something new, something that I couldn't understand. The final entry, scrawled in jagged letters, read, "Asterisk, it's not over. It's still here, and it will never leave. Asterisk." I looked up, my breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing against me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the chair was facing, I saw a figure, a shadow, moving in the darkness. It was tall, too tall, its form shifting like smoke. I could barely make out its features, but the eyes, they were there, glowing in the darkness, watching me. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer, more solid. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, but it was too late. It lunged. Would you like to continue with Chapter 11? I don't know how I made it out of that room. The terror was so raw, so suffocating, that it felt like my mind had shut down entirely. I couldn't think, couldn't feel anything other than the overwhelming need to escape. I bolted from the room, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't dare look back, not at the figure, not at the darkness that seemed to consume everything around me. The house was alive with the sounds of creaking, of whispers that crawled along the walls, following me, taunting me. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet as I crashed into the hallway. My breath was coming in sharp gasps, but there was no time to stop, no time to think. I had to get out. The front door was right there, so close, but something stopped me. The house was shaking. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned like they were about to splinter. The walls rattled, and the windows rattled with a force that was impossible to ignore. It was as if the house itself was reacting to the disturbance I had caused. The things I had uncovered, the door I had opened. I slammed into the front door, desperate to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at my chest. my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled with the doorknob. It felt like an eternity before the door finally gave way, creaking open into the night air. The moment I stepped outside, I was hit with a wave of coldness that made me shiver to my very bones. The night was still, unnaturally so, as if the world had gone quiet just for me. I turned around, expecting to see the house behind me, but nothing. The house was gone. There was no crumbling structure, no sagging roof, no decaying windows. Just an empty lot, barren and lifeless. It was as if the house had never been there at all. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Had it all been a hallucination, a nightmare brought to life by my fear? But then I remembered the journal, Samuel Whitaker's journal, the final entry, and the warning that had sent a chill through my spine. Asterisk, it's still here, and it will never leave. Asterisk, I had to know what that meant. I couldn't just walk away, pretending like nothing had happened. I needed answers. But before I could move, before I could even think, the ground beneath my feet trembled. The earth shook violently, knocking me off balance. I fell to the ground, gasping for air, as the ground cracked open in front of me. A dark, swirling void opened in the earth, an abyss that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air around me grew thick, heavy, like the weight of the world was bearing down on me. I could hear it, the whispering, the same voice from the house, growing louder, more frantic. It was coming from the darkness, calling to me. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. The darkness reached out, tendrils of shadow crawling toward me like hungry fingers. I could feel the cold, the raw, unnatural chill of it seeping into my skin, into my bones. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, my body paralyzed by the overwhelming fear, unable to escape the pull of the darkness. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they were all I could hear, all I could feel. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The darkness vanished. The ground stopped shaking, and the night returned to its eerie stillness. I stood there, trembling, barely able to process what had just happened, what had almost happened. I looked around, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps, but I couldn't see anything. No more darkness. No more shadow. The lot was empty again, just as it had been before. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. But then I heard it, a faint sound, barely perceptible but unmistakable. The creak of floorboards, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. I turned around, my heart sinking as I saw it. The house. It was back. And this time, it wasn't empty. A figure stood in the doorway, watching me. I knew who it was before I even saw its face. Samuel Whitaker. His eyes glowed with a strange, unnatural light, and his mouth twisted into a grin that made my blood run cold. He raised his hand, and the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. And then I understood. The house, the thing I had unleashed, it wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a trap, and I was its next victim. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. Would you like to continue with Chapter 12? I ran without looking back, my legs burning, my breath ragged, my mind in chaos. The house, the thing in the doorway, wasn't just a house. It was something far worse. It was a prison, a living nightmare that fed off fear, that kept pulling people back into its depths. And I was no different. The streets blurred around me, but I didn't care where I was going. I didn't care about anything except escaping, getting as far away from the nightmare I had woken up in. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, I couldn't escape. It felt like the world was closing in on me, like every step I took only brought me closer to it, to the house. The whispers followed me, curling around my ears, dragging me back, pulling me toward the abyss. I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground, but I managed to catch myself. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop. I didn't know how much time had passed, but when I finally glanced up, the familiar streets were gone. Instead, I was in a place I had never seen before, an endless stretch of empty land, overgrown with weeds and twisted trees. The sky above me was dark, swirling with clouds that seemed to move unnaturally, like they were being pushed by something unseen. And there it was again, the house. It stood in the distance, looming over the barren landscape. The windows were dark, the doors slightly ajar. I could feel the pull of it, the irresistible tug that drew me toward it, even though every part of me screamed to run in the other direction. But I couldn't fight it anymore. The house had me. I had woken it, and now it was going to finish what it had started. I stumbled forward, my body moving on its own, like I was sleepwalking, like I was under the influence of something far more powerful than I was. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, until they were all I could hear. The air was thick, suffocating, and every step felt heavier than the last. I reached the door. My hand was shaking as I pushed it open, and it creaked in protest, as if the house itself was welcoming me back. Inside, everything was the same decaying wallpaper, the same musty smell of rot and dust. But there was something different now, something alive. I could feel the presence in the house. It was watching me, waiting for me to do something, to fall into its trap. And then I saw it. In the middle of the room, on the floor, was a circle of symbols. Symbols I had seen before in Samuel Whitaker's journal. The same dark, twisted runes that had filled the pages with warnings and curses. I took a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest, and the floor beneath me groaned. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And there, in the center of the circle, was a figure. It was the same figure I had seen before. The shadow, the creature that had been haunting me since the moment I stepped foot in this cursed place. But now, it was no longer a shadow. It was real, solid, standing before me. Its face was featureless, an empty void where its eyes should have been. But I could feel its gaze on me. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I froze. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't obey me. It was like I was trapped, caught in a web of terror that I couldn't escape. The creature stepped forward, its form flickering like a dying flame. The air around it grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that I could see frost forming on the walls. It reached out to me, its hand or whatever it was, stretching toward me, its fingers long and skeletal. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was trying to communicate with me, trying to pull me into the darkness. And then I saw it, the doorway, the door to escape. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted toward it, running as fast as I could. But the house wasn't going to let me leave. The door slammed shut in front of me, trapping me inside. The walls began to close in, the floor beneath me shaking with unnatural force. The creature was close now, its presence suffocating, its whispering deafening. It was in my head, in my soul, pulling me into the depths. I fell to my knees, my body trembling, unable to move, unable to escape. The darkness was swallowing me whole, and there was nothing left to do but accept my fate. But as I felt the darkness claim me, I heard one final whisper. Asterisk, it's not over. It will never be over. Asterisk. And then everything went black. Story 3. I never thought I'd be here. Alone. The house was old, its bones creaking under the weight of years, and its paint peeling like dried skin. But it was mine now, or at least it would be for as long as I could pay the rent. That was the deal. I was moving in, starting fresh. A new chapter in a new town after everything fell apart. The divorce had been messy, 1,000 emotions crashing into each other until there was nothing left but emptiness. I needed space, both physically and mentally, to breathe and think. So when I saw the listing for this house, A small, run-down place with a yard covered in weeds and a front porch that seemed to sag under its own weight. I took it without thinking twice. It was cheap, and cheap was good enough for me. The first thing I noticed when I entered was a smell. Musty, like old books, mixed with something else. Something that seemed off. I figured it was just the age of the place. The floors groaned beneath my feet as I made my way through the rooms. There was a charm to it. Something that felt homey despite the layers of dust. The living room had a fireplace. The kind that wasn't used anymore but still looked inviting. The kitchen had chipped tiles, and the cabinets squeaked when opened. Nothing unusual, at least not yet. I moved my boxes in, taking my time to unpack the few things I had left after the divorce. Clothes, books, some old furniture I'd kept. Nothing extravagant. I set up the bed in the bedroom on the second floor. It was a small room with a view of the street below. The windows were old, the kind that rattled when the wind picked up. But for now, it felt like a new beginning, like I could finally find some peace. The neighbors, at least the ones I met, seemed nice. There was Mrs. Gray, who lived next door in a similarly run-down house. She was older, her face lined with age, but her smile was warm when she spoke. She stopped by to introduce herself as I was hauling in my last box. "You're the new tenant then?" she asked, her voice low and raspy. "Yeah, just moved in," I said, smiling awkwardly. "Nice to meet you." She glanced at the house, her eyes flicking from the cracked paint to the sagging porch. "Well, it's cozy, but I wouldn't stay too long if I were you." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Gray hesitated before speaking, as if weighing her words. "The house, it has a history, you know. People don't usually stay for long. They say it's haunted." She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "The last tenants, they left in a hurry, ran out in the middle of the night, said something about curses. Some say there's a presence here, something not quite right." I chuckled, unsure if she was serious or just playing with me. "I'm sure it's just an old house settling. You know how these places are." She didn't laugh, though. She just looked at me with a knowing expression. "Maybe. Just be careful, all right." She turned to go, but then stopped. "Oh, and one more thing. Keep the lights on at night, if you can. The shadows can get a little thick around here." I stood there, watching her walk back to her house. Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a chill. I laughed it off. It was just an old woman with an overactive imagination. The house was old, sure, but that didn't mean there was something supernatural going on. As night fell, and I finished unpacking, I found myself looking out the bedroom window. The street was quiet. The houses lined up in the fading light like forgotten soldiers standing guard. I could hear the occasional car pass by, the soft hum of the world outside. But inside, it was silent, too silent, a silence that seemed to press in on me, making everything feel heavier. I shook it off and crawled into bed, pulling the thick blanket up to my chin. The house creaked again, just like it had before. Old wood, old bones. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the thought that something was watching me, something waiting. The creaking continued. I tried to ignore it, but the sound felt too deliberate, too purposeful. I told myself it was just the house settling, but as I lay there, listening to the steady groan of the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first night passed in uneasy silence. I didn't sleep well. The creaks in the floorboards seemed to follow me around the house, echoing in the dark like whispers. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind pushing against the windows, but deep down, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When morning came, the sunlight broke through the dusty curtains, and I forced myself to rise, brushing off the strange sensations. I went through the motions of making coffee, unpacking a few more boxes, and setting up a small workspace in the corner of the living room. The day felt normal, at least on the surface. I made a point to ignore the odd, almost imperceptible noises that continued to come from upstairs. It was nothing, I told myself. Just the house. Just the old reacting to the temperature change, to the weight of time. Nothing more. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. Mrs. Gray had warned me about the house's history, and I wasn't sure whether to believe her or not. I had no reason to think anything strange would happen. Nothing truly bad had happened yet, after all. But as I walked down the street, I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The house seemed to loom in the distance, darker now in the fading light. There was something about it, something that made the air around it feel colder than it should. When I returned, I was determined to make myself comfortable. I cooked a simple dinner and sat down to eat, trying to push the unease aside. But as the evening wore on, I began to hear it again, the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. I heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps coming from above, like someone pacing back and forth. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. My heart started to race. I looked toward the staircase, the shadow of the hallway stretching dark and foreboding. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, just the natural sounds of an old building. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, as though someone was walking directly above me. I stood up slowly, the hairs on my arms prickling with the growing tension. I had to check. I had to make sure. I climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the top, I stood at the edge of the hallway. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, the room beyond a void of darkness. Nothing. No footsteps. No sounds. Just silence. I took a deep breath, convincing myself that I was overthinking it. The house was just old. Old houses made noise, right? Of course, they did. I turned back and went downstairs, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that crawled up my spine. The house felt different now, heavier. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. That night, I made sure to lock every door, every window. I pulled the covers up around me tightly and tried to sleep. The shadows danced on the walls, the faint sounds of the house's groans filling the air. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I felt it. The bed. It shifted beneath me, like something had sat on the edge, a weight pressing down on the mattress. My heart thudded in my chest, and I shot up in bed, my breath quick and shallow. The room was still. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. But that feeling, the feeling of something waiting, was there. I turned on the bedside lamp, the harsh light illuminating the room in a sickly yellow glow. My eyes scanned the corners, the shadows, the space under the bed. Nothing, just emptiness. Yet the air felt thick, heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight, something that I couldn't see but could feel. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and texted a friend back home, someone who would never understand, but someone I could reach out to. I asked if everything was okay, if I was just being paranoid. I sat there, waiting for a reply, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing it. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it, a sound, soft, barely audible, a whisper. It came from downstairs. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The whisper, faint and unintelligible, was followed by another sound, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, then closed. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I stared at the door. The air seemed to press in on me. Every breath I took feeling harder than the last. I had to know. I had to check. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a dull thud. I grabbed my phone, the only source of light in the darkness, and moved cautiously toward the door. The hallway stretched in front of me, dark and silent. And then, as I took my first step toward the stairs, I heard it again, a low whisper, this time clearer, like someone was standing just at the edge of the hallway. waiting for me to turn. "Don't go down there." I froze. The whisper didn't come from anywhere I could see. It came from within me. My own thoughts, my own fear, twisting into something other. But something inside me urged me to move, to go down there, to face whatever it was that lurked in the shadows. And as I stood there, heart pounding, the silence stretched on, leaving only the echo of the house's breath and the whisper. I couldn't sleep that night. I spent hours lying in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, the whispers echoing in my mind like a constant hum. Every creak of the house seemed to reverberate in my bones, sending shivers down my spine. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing, waiting. The next morning, I tried to shake off the events of the previous night, convincing myself it was just my imagination, a result of too much stress and too little sleep. The house was old, yes, but that didn't mean it was haunted. There had to be a logical explanation for the sounds, the whispers, the strange feeling of being watched. I decided to spend the day exploring the house. It was the only way to make myself feel in control again. The more I knew about the house, the more I could rationalize everything away. So, I started in the attic. The door to the attic was hidden behind a small, narrow staircase at the end of the hallway. I'd noticed it the night before, but hadn't thought to open it. Now, I was determined to see what was up there. The wooden door creaked loudly as I pulled it open, a thick layer of dust spilling out into the hallway. The attic was cramped, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets and stacks of forgotten boxes. It smelled of mildew and age, the kind of scent that lingered in your nostrils long after you left. I flicked the light switch, but the bulb only flickered dimly before going out completely. Great. Of course, it wasn't going to be that easy. I found a flashlight in one of the boxes and switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. As I moved deeper into the attic, my foot caught on something hidden beneath a pile of old blankets. I stumbled forward, barely catching myself against a dusty dresser. I looked down, noticing an old wooden box beneath the pile. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and covered in a thick layer of dust. I bent down, brushing off the dirt to reveal an intricate design carved into the wood, a symbol I didn't recognize. I hesitated, unsure whether to open it, but curiosity won out. I lifted the lid slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, there was a small journal, its leather cover worn and cracked with age. I ran my fingers over it, feeling a strange, cold sensation as I touched it. Without thinking, I opened it. The first page was filled with messy, hurried writing. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me as I read. Asterisk, I can feel it now. The presence. It's getting stronger every night. I don't know how much longer I can stay. The house is changing. It's alive. I've seen it in the shadows, heard it whispering my name. I'm afraid I've opened something that can never be closed again. Asterisk. I turned the page, my hand shaking slightly. Asterisk. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I tried to burn the book, but the flames wouldn't touch it. It keeps calling me. I can't stop it. Asterisk. The writing grew more frantic as I flipped through the pages. The words became a jumble of sentences, each one more desperate than the last. The handwriting became sloppier, more erratic, as if the writer was losing control of their thoughts. Asterisk, the rituals are the only way to keep it at bay. I have to finish what I started. Asterisk, my throat tightened as I read the last entry. Asterisk, it's here. I can feel it in the walls. The curse is complete. It's waiting for the next one. Asterisk, I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The air around me felt colder, heavier, as if something had shifted in the house. Something was watching me. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. The attic suddenly felt much smaller. the walls closing in on me. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards below, the faint sound of something moving in the shadows. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in this house anymore. Not after reading that. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something kept me rooted to the spot, a strange magnetic pull. I stuffed the journal into my bag and bolted down the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't want to know more. Didn't want to understand whatever curse had been placed on this house. But deep down, I knew I had to keep going. There was something in the house, something that had been waiting for me, and it wasn't done with me yet. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Every time I closed my eyes, the words echoed in my mind. Asterisk, the curse is complete. It's waiting for the next one. Asterisk, who had written it. What had they been trying to say? And what was it that had been awakened in the house? I had to know more, but the fear that gnawed at me told me to leave it alone, to pack up and go before it was too late. But it was already too late, wasn't it? I sat in the small living room, the journal still stuffed in my bag beside me, its weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't ignore it, not anymore. The house had changed, the atmosphere thickened, as if something sinister was slowly seeping into every crevice of the walls. The noises had started up again that night. The heavy footsteps, the soft, scraping sounds like something dragging across the floor. The whispers, too. They were louder now, more distinct. They were no longer just in my mind. I could hear them, faint, yet unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that the house was old, that I was just jumpy. But as I sat there, the whispers began to rise in volume. They were coming from the hallway, from upstairs. No, not just from upstairs. The whole house seemed to hum with the sound. It felt as if the very walls were alive, breathing in time with my own heartbeat. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and grabbed the journal. I needed answers. I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. I went straight to the library. There was a shelf of old books tucked away in the corner. Books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Maybe, just maybe, there would be something there to explain what was going on. I ran my fingers along the spines, pulling down one book after another. They were all about local history, the house's original owner, and strange folklore. Then I found it, a thick, dusty tome with no title, just a strange symbol etched on the cover. I opened it, and a sense of dread washed over me. The pages were filled with detailed drawings and descriptions, rituals, symbols, and warnings. Warnings about curses, about things that were never meant to be disturbed. The same symbols from the journal. I flicked through the pages, reading about an ancient ritual performed by the house's original owner, a woman obsessed with the occult. She had tried to open a door, they said, to something beyond this world, and something had answered. I felt my stomach churn as I read further. The ritual hadn't gone as planned. The woman had failed to close the door, leaving it open, leaving something behind. Something was still here. The whispers grew louder as I read the final passage. The house itself had become a prison, a vessel for whatever had crossed over during that ritual. It was waiting for the next person, the next victim, to unlock the door completely, to finish what had been started. The room around me felt colder, the shadows growing longer. I looked up from the book, my eyes scanning the room. The air seemed thicker now, heavier. I could hear the whispers clearly, soft but insistent. Come closer. I froze. The voice wasn't in my head. It was real. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just a dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the book, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I turned toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard the sound again. This time closer. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the staircase. Heavy footsteps. But not from above this time. No. These footsteps were coming from below. I didn't look back. I ran. I flew down the hallway, my feet pounding against the creaky floorboards as I made my way toward the front door. But when I reached it, I stopped. The door was locked. I tugged at the handle, frantic, panic rising in my chest. I turned the deadbolt, but it wouldn't budge. I wasn't going anywhere. I was trapped. The footsteps were closer now, and I could hear them coming up the stairs, slow and steady, dragging something behind them. The air felt suffocating, the temperature dropping as if the room itself had become a tomb. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder. Come closer. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the foot of the stairs, just out of the light, but I could make out the shape of it. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs and a face obscured by shadows. Its eyes, no asterisk, its eyes were the worst part. They glowed faintly, like the reflection of moonlight on water. But they were not human. They were dark, endless pits that seemed to swallow everything around them. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My heart raced. I had to do something. Anything. I bolted toward the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was expecting to do with it, but I couldn't just stand there. But when I turned back to look, the figure was gone. I stood there, panting, staring at the darkened hallway. The air was still, silent, too silent. I didn't know what to do. The house was no longer just a house. It was something else, something ancient, something evil. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late. But when I tried to open the front door again, it was locked, and I couldn't escape. The whispers returned louder now, and I knew it was coming for me, and I had no way out. The door wouldn't open. No matter how many times I tried to turn the handle, it refused to budge. I stepped back, breathing heavily, my mind racing. The kitchen was still dark, save for the faint light filtering through the curtains. The shadows felt like they were closing in on me, thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest. I needed to think. I needed to calm down. I couldn't lose myself to panic, not yet. I looked around, scanning the room for anything useful. There was nothing but the looming presence of whatever was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they returned. I could still hear the dragging footsteps echoing in the distance, slow, steady, and deliberate. The house was alive, and it was waiting for me. I turned away from the door, my eyes landing on the hallway that led deeper into the house. The stairs loomed ahead, like a dark invitation. The whispers were louder now, no longer just distant murmurs. They were inside my head, swirling like a cloud of bees. I couldn't stay here. I had to escape, but I couldn't just run out into the night without knowing what I was up against. I needed to find out what this thing was. I needed to know why it was here. I made up my mind. I had to go back to the attic. I had already found the journal, but I hadn't finished it. I didn't want to, but I had to. I had to know more. Maybe the answers were there. The truth. I walked quickly down the hallway, past the front door that refused to open, past the old portraits hanging on the walls, faces staring down at me with blank, lifeless eyes. The darkness seemed to stretch before me. Each step I took drawing me closer to whatever was waiting. The attic door loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming. I gripped the handle, the wood cold under my palm. The moment I opened it, the musty scent of old dust hit me like a wave. I stepped inside, my flashlight flickering to life. The attic was the same as before, cluttered and cramped, but now it felt different. The air was thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. I moved to the far corner where I had found the journal, but it was no longer there. Panic surged in my chest. Where was it? My flashlight beam swept across the room, searching. And then I saw it, the journal, lying open on the floor, its pages turning as if blown by an invisible wind. The words on the page danced and twisted, as if alive. I felt my heart race. I approached cautiously, my hands trembling as I bent down to pick it up. The moment my fingers touched the leather cover, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my mind with an unbearable pressure. They seemed to be coming from inside the journal, twisting the words, making them shift and change. I opened the journal to the last page, and my blood ran cold. Asterisk, it's too late. The door has opened. It cannot be closed again. It watches. It waits. And soon it will come for you. Asterisk. The air around me grew colder, and I felt the presence again. The thing that had been following me, watching me. But now, it was closer. Much closer. I felt the temperature drop further, the cold seeping into my bones. I turned around, but I couldn't see anything. The shadows in the attic were so thick, they seemed to swallow the light. I heard a creak from behind me, the floorboards shifting. I spun around, but still nothing, just the darkness. And then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, dragging. They were right behind me. My pulse thudded in my ears. I didn't dare turn around. I knew what I would see. It was the same thing that had been following me since I moved in, the tall, dark figure with the glowing eyes. But this time, it was different. I could feel it. The air around me had changed. It was more than just a figure now. Something had crossed over. Something ancient, something dark. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, and my foot hit something cold. I looked down, and my eyes widened in horror. It was a door I hadn't seen before. It was small, tucked away behind a stack of old boxes. It hadn't been there earlier, but now it was the only way out. The whispers grew louder, urging me forward. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking as I turned it. The door creaked open with an awful groan. Beyond it was a room I didn't recognize. A small, dark space, lit only by a single flickering candle on the floor. I stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind me, and then I saw it, a figure, cloaked in shadow, standing at the far side of the room. Its eyes burned, glowing with an unnatural light. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air was thick, suffocating. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me like a hurricane. I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. And then it spoke. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come here. Asterisk, the voice was cold, like ice against my skin. It wasn't human. It was something else. I didn't know what to do. I had to escape. I had to. Suddenly, the walls began to close in. The room was shrinking, the shadows stretching toward me, like hands reaching from the darkness. I ran as fast as I could, slamming into the door and bursting out into the hallway. But when I turned around, the door was gone. The room, the figure, everything had vanished. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I was back in the hallway. The house was silent again, but I knew something had changed. I knew I wasn't alone anymore, and I didn't know how much longer I could last. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? After everything that had happened, I couldn't close my eyes without seeing the glowing eyes in the dark, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The house creaked and groaned, like it was breathing, moving in ways I couldn't understand. I didn't feel safe anywhere, not in the bedroom, not in the living room, and especially not in the attic. The house had become a labyrinth of fear, each room a prison. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the front door, staring out at the world beyond. The light of day didn't ease the weight in my chest. I had been avoiding going outside, trying to forget about the strange events that had plagued me since I moved in. But today was different. The oppressive feeling of the house was too much to bear. I needed air, I needed distance. So I stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against my skin. But it didn't help. I could still feel the house's grip on me, its pull tugging at my mind. I walked down the overgrown path, my thoughts racing. Was I losing my mind? Was it the house? Or was something more sinister at play? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every step I took, every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye, seemed to be watching me. Every gust of wind carried with it whispers, faint and indistinct, like the voice of the house itself. As I wandered aimlessly down the street, I passed by a small convenience store. It was one of the few places open this early. I stepped inside, hoping to distract myself from the growing unease in my chest. The store was dimly lit, the shelves cluttered with products that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The cashier, an older man with a grizzled face, looked up at me from behind the counter. "New to town?" he asked, his voice low and rough. I nodded, not sure what to say. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. "Place you moved into," he continued, leaning forward. "It's got a bit of a reputation around here." My pulse quickened, but I tried to keep my composure. "What do you mean?" He glanced around, as though checking to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned closer. "It's an old house, you know. Some strange things have happened there. People who lived there before, they left in a hurry. One guy, a few years back, ran out of there at night, screaming. He was babbling about curses. Said he'd heard footsteps, voices in the walls. You know, the usual stuff. People like to talk." My blood ran cold. "What kind of footsteps?" He shrugged, his eyes distant, like he was reliving something unpleasant. "Heavy ones, like someone was walking around in boots. But there was no one there." I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. "And that's it? Just rumors?" The cashier shook his head, his expression turning grim. "No, it's more than that. Some say the original owner was into darker things. The occult, rituals. They say she opened a door that should have stayed closed." I felt a chill run down my spine. The words echoed in my mind. Asterisk a door that should have stayed closed star. "The house is cursed," he added, his voice low. "The spirits inside don't like being disturbed." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, tell him it was just superstition. But the other part of me, the part that had been hearing those footsteps, feeling the cold air in the middle of the night, knew he was telling the truth. I left the store without another word, my mind racing. The day outside seemed brighter, but it didn't feel any safer. The whispers hadn't stopped since I left the house. They were in my head, crawling under my skin. And I knew now, without a doubt, that whatever haunted that place wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. By the time I returned home, the sun had begun to set, casting long, sinister shadows across the yard. The house loomed before me, its windows like dark, empty eyes staring out at the world. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. I stepped inside, and the silence was deafening. The air was thick with tension, as though the house was holding its breath. I didn't want to go upstairs, but I knew I had to. The attic, the journal. I had to find out more. I had to know if this curse was real, and if it was what it wanted from me. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed something strange. The creaking floorboards were louder now, as though the house itself was complaining, groaning in protest. I reached the top of the stairs and paused. The attic door was wide open. It wasn't supposed to be. I was sure I had closed it before I left. I stepped forward, heart pounding in my chest. I knew I wasn't alone in the house. I could feel the presence, the weight of something behind me, breathing down my neck. I slowly entered the attic, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. The room was still cluttered, but there was something different. The air was heavier, like the very walls were closing in on me. And then I saw it, the journal. It was sitting on the floor, open, The pages were turning, as if someone or something was reading it. I took a step closer, my fingers trembling as I reached down to touch the pages. The moment I did, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more urgent. And then in the midst of them, I heard a voice, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk, I jerked back, my breath caught in my throat. The air around me turned icy cold, and I felt a hand, no, something pressing down on my shoulder, cold and clammy. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I ran, out of the attic, down the stairs, and into the hallway. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The footsteps, they were louder now, closer, and they were following me. I couldn't breathe. The cold was suffocating. The walls closing in on me as I raced down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor, desperately trying to escape whatever was following me. But the footsteps, they were right behind me. They echoed through the house with a rhythm, like they were in sync with my own heartbeat. Heavy, relentless. I ran faster, my mind clouded with panic. I wasn't sure where I was going. I just needed to get out. I needed to leave this cursed house before it consumed me too. But every corner I turned, the house seemed to stretch, the rooms becoming unfamiliar, like I was trapped in a maze that refused to let me go. The whispers were back, louder than ever. They slithered into my ears, cold and insistent. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. You're not supposed to be here. They're watching you, asterisk. I stopped, my chest heaving, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around me. I felt dizzy, disoriented. I had to find the door. I had to get out. I turned to my right, and my eyes landed on the front door. It was still closed, still locked, but the handle was shaking as though someone or something was trying to get in. I reached for the door, my hand trembling. Just as my fingers touched the cool metal of the doorknob, the floor beneath me groaned. The entire house seemed to shudder, as if it were alive, waking up from some deep slumber. I felt it then, the oppressive presence, the weight of eyes watching me from the darkness. The door didn't open. I tried again, harder this time, twisting the knob with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled, yanked, until my hands were raw, but the door remained stubbornly locked. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor behind me. I froze. The dragging sound stopped, and then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps. I wasn't alone. Someone was coming toward me, and it wasn't human. I turned around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There, at the far end of the hallway, a figure stood in the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and the way it moved was wrong. It didn't walk like a person. It floated, gliding toward me, its limbs elongated, and its body twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. I stumbled backward, my eyes wide with terror. The footsteps grew louder, faster, and the figure stepped into the light. I screamed. It had no face, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a skull-like structure. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow pits of darkness. There was no expression, no emotion, just an empty void staring back at me. I ran, panic taking over. I didn't care where I went now. I just needed to get away. I bolted up the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me, and I reached the attic door, throwing it open without thinking. I didn't care that the attic was the source of all my fears. I just needed to escape from that thing. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if I were stepping into a place where reality itself was starting to warp. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me, puffing out in small clouds. I turned back toward the attic door. It had closed on its own. There was no way out. The house was trapping me. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the attic, searching for any kind of escape. But there was nothing, just piles of old furniture and dusty boxes, the remnants of lives lived long ago. The journal was still on the floor, lying open, but I had no time for it. I had to get out, but then I heard it again, the footsteps. They were closer now, louder, more urgent. Something was coming for me. I looked around frantically, my mind racing. There had to be a way out, a hidden door or a passage. I ran to the far corner of the attic, where the old wooden beams were exposed. I knew this house like the back of my hand by now. I had explored every inch of it, or so I thought. But there was something new, a small, faint crack in the wall. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was this the way out? I rushed over to it, my hands shaking as I tried to pry it open. The crack widened with a groan of protest, and I shoved my hand inside, feeling the rough, splintered wood. Something shifted, and then, asterisk click asterisk, the wall moved. A hidden door. I couldn't believe it. My pulse raced as I pushed the door open, revealing a narrow passage that led down into darkness. But before I could move, I heard a voice, low and guttural, like the house itself was speaking to me. Asterisk, you can't leave. You're part of it now. Asterisk. I turned, heart pounding, but the attic was empty. The thing, whatever it was gone. The air in the passageway felt even colder. I had no choice. I stepped forward into the dark, praying I wasn't too late. I couldn't go back now, not after what I had uncovered, after what I had seen. The house had already claimed me, and I was starting to understand whatever was haunting it, whatever cursed it, was not done with me yet. I had to keep moving. The passageway was narrow, and my shoulders scraped against the stone walls as I crept forward, the silence of the house pressing down on me. The darkness was thick here, so much heavier than it had been in the attic. I could feel the weight of it on my chest, as if the very air was trying to squeeze the life out of me. The passage twisted and turned, and I had no idea where it led, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back. The thing in the attic was still fresh in my mind, its hollow, empty eyes staring at me. Whatever it wasn't human, and I had no intention of finding out more. But I had to know about the house. I had to know what was happening, what I had stumbled into. The journal in the attic had answered some of my questions, but I had to learn more. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was survival. Finally, the passage opened up into a small, dimly lit room. The air smelled stale, damp, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I hesitated before stepping inside, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. It felt wrong. The room was too perfect, too still, as though it were waiting for something. A single candle flickered in the corner, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. On the floor, in front of the candle, was another journal. It looked old, older than the one I had found in the attic, and it was lying open, as if someone had left it there for me to read. I knelt down and opened the journal carefully, my hands shaking. The pages were yellowed with age. The ink faded in some places, but the words were still legible. The entries were written in the same frantic handwriting as the one in the attic, but this one was different. It wasn't about the house in the way I expected. It was about something else, something darker. March 3rd, 1922. Asterisk, the rituals are nearly complete. The doorway is open, though I have not yet seen what comes through. But it is here. I can feel it in the air. It is calling to me, and I cannot resist asterisk. I felt my stomach twist. The doorway, the thing that had followed me, had it come through from whatever this man had opened? I flipped through more pages, desperate for answers. March 12th, 1922. Asterisk, the house is changing. The walls seem to breathe. I hear footsteps in the night, but they are not my own. The air grows colder, and I sense that I am not alone. The presence is growing stronger, and I must finish the final part of the ritual asterisk. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to breathe through the panic rising in my chest. The footsteps, the cold spots, the whispers in the walls. It was all connected. The house hadn't just been built here. It had been made. The rituals, the doorway. I forced myself to read on, my voice barely a whisper as I muttered the words aloud. April 5th, 1922. Asterisk, I have succeeded. The door is open, and the thing is crossed over. It will not leave, and neither will I. We are one now. It is in me, and I am in it. I am no longer human. I am the house, and the house is me, asterisk. I dropped the journal, my heart racing. I wanted to throw it away, to run from this place and never look back. But the truth had already sunk in. The house wasn't just haunted. It had been made to hold something that had crossed over into this world. And now it was waiting for me. A loud bang echoed from behind me, and I whirled around, panic surging through me. The candle flickered violently, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. And then I heard it, the same dragging sound, the same footsteps, but this time they were closer, much closer. The door to the room slammed shut with a deafening crash. I didn't have time to think. I bolted for the only window, grabbing the bars in a desperate attempt to pry them loose. But it was too late. I heard the breathing first, slow, ragged, coming from just behind me. My heart raced as I turned, fear flooding my veins. The thing from the attic stood in the doorway, its form even darker now, more solid, its hollow eyes fixed on me, its mouth opening in a grotesque, silent scream. And then I saw it, the shadow of something behind it moving, writhing in the darkness. The house was alive, and it was hungry. I ran. I didn't even look back. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I had to get out. I had to escape. The doorway was just ahead, but it felt so far away. I could hear it now. The thing, the presence, following me, growing stronger with every step I took. It was in the walls, in the floor, in the air. It was everywhere. I reached the door, my hands fumbling for the handle. But it wouldn't open. It was locked. It was always locked. I heard the breath behind me again, and then the whisper, cold and dark, "You can never leave." I spun around, ready to face whatever was coming. But there was nothing there. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. Something was waiting. I couldn't breathe. Click. The door swung open on its own, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could, down the stairs, out the front door, and into the night. But as I stood there in the yard panting, I could hear the house behind me, creaking, groaning, alive. The walls whispered, and the footsteps echoed once more. It hadn't let me go, and I wasn't sure I was ever going to escape. The house was still waiting. I didn't stop running. My legs burned, and my heart hammered so violently I thought it might burst, but I couldn't slow down. Not yet. Not when I still felt the suffocating grip of the house, like a shadow trailing me, just out of sight but never quite gone. My breath was ragged as I stumbled down the overgrown path that led away from the house, the trees on either side whispering in the wind as if they, too, were in on whatever secret the house held. I didn't dare look back. I kept my eyes straight ahead, focused on the distant streetlights that flickered like distant stars. The air was thick, colder than it had any right to be at this hour. I couldn't escape the sensation that something was wrong. Something was following me, just beyond the edge of my vision, something too close. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, not just in the distance, but as if they were right there, almost keeping pace with mine. I spun around, but the road was empty, just trees, and then the house in the distance, looming like a specter. It was dark, silent, too silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it was watching me, waiting. I didn't want to go back. I didn't even want to look at it, but the urge was overwhelming. I turned, Not sure if it was curiosity or fear that had drawn me back, but there it was, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. And then, like a switch had been flipped, the windows of the house flickered to life, one by one, as if the house itself had come alive. I froze. The lights, the cold, unfeeling lights, cast long shadows across the yard. I could see them, those faint, twisted shapes moving just beyond the glass. Faces, or perhaps I was imagining it, but there were definitely eyes. Watching, always watching. I stepped back, my hands trembling, and then I heard it. Whispers, low and unintelligible, but undeniably coming from the house. Like 1,000 voices murmuring from the walls, too soft to make out, but their tone unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was the house. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the lights went out. The yard was plunged into darkness. I turned and ran again, faster now, not looking back, not caring where I was going. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, the heaviness of the house pressing against my ribs, like it was trying to pull me back in. The whispers didn't stop. They were still there, tugging at my mind, coaxing me, telling me I had to return. I stumbled over something in the darkness, my foot catching on a root, and I fell to the ground. I barely had time to brace myself before I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, crunching the gravel behind me. Someone or something was coming, and it wasn't human. I forced myself up, my breath shallow, heart racing. My hands scraped against the rough ground as I pushed myself forward. I couldn't see what was behind me, but I didn't need to. The sound of its steps was enough. The breath, ragged and shallow, followed too closely. A thick, suffocating presence. I reached the street and ran toward the nearest light, the distant glow of civilization, as if the streetlight could shield me from whatever was coming. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, too close. I glanced over my shoulder, just for a moment, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But there, in the corner of my vision, I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, too tall, too thin, and impossibly still. I screamed and kept running, but it was there. The figure, no longer just a shadow, was moving now, not toward me, but toward the house. Toward that house. And then it vanished into the dark. I skidded to a stop, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing, no figure, no movement, only the stillness of the street, the hum of distant cars, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I was alone. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. My skin crawled, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It was still there. I could feel it. I could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive, wrapping around me like a cocoon of fear. I didn't know what I had just seen. I didn't know what was following me, but I knew one thing. I wasn't safe. I had to leave. I had to leave the town. But no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had awakened was still hunting me, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever escape it. I took a few more steps, my mind racing, when I heard it again, the same whispering, but this time it was clearer, closer. Come back. The voice was soft, like a breath on the wind, but unmistakable. It was calling me, drawing me back to that house. I couldn't resist. I turned around, just one last time, and then the streetlights flickered, casting the shadows of the house across the yard. The house that wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive. It was watching. It was waiting. For me. I couldn't stop myself from walking toward the house. The moment I heard it, the whisper, soft and inviting like a lover's call, I knew there was no turning back. The air around me seemed to shift, drawing me in, like invisible hands guiding my steps. The streetlight flickered once more as I approached the property line, casting long, exaggerated shadows that danced with eerie life. The house stood there, looming like a sentinel in the dark, its windows now gleaming faintly in the night. There was something unsettling about the way the lights glowed. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, unyielding. I should have turned away. I should have run. Kept going until I was far from here, far from the thing that had been hunting me. But I couldn't. Every step toward that house felt like it was pulling me closer to an answer, an explanation for the madness that had consumed me since I moved in. Every whisper, every creak, every shadow. Nothing made sense, and yet everything felt connected. I reached the front door, my hand trembling as I grasped the cold brass doorknob. It felt alive in my hand, pulsating with a strange energy. I hesitated for a long moment, unsure of whether I should continue. But the whispers, they were louder now, as if the house itself was calling me inside. There was no choice. I had to go in. The door opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me like an old friend. The house felt different now. The air was heavier, thick with the scent of must and decay. And yet there was something almost alive about it. Something breathing in the walls and the floor, in the very air I breathed. I closed the door behind me, and as I turned, I heard it. A single, loud bang from upstairs. A door slamming shut. My heart leapt in my chest, the familiar dread crawling up my spine. I knew what that sound meant. Something was in this house. Something that didn't want to be disturbed. Something waiting for me to make the wrong move. The whispering grew louder, now echoing from all directions, swirling around me like a vortex. I could feel my skin prickling with the sensation that I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone at all. I took a few hesitant steps toward the stairs, each one feeling heavier than the last. I had to go up. I had to know what was waiting for me up there. The journal, the truth about the house, its curse, the rituals. It was all up there. It was all connected. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I paused again, listening. The house was quieter now, except for the faint, rhythmic thumping coming from the upper floor. It was like someone was pacing back and forth in one of the rooms, or maybe something was dragging its feet across the floor, just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. The house had been settling for years, and yet the noises had never been this deliberate. There was something purposeful in the way the thumps echoed through the air, something alive. I took the first step, then another, my breath shallow, my every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to never return. But I ignored it. The lure of the unknown was too strong. I had come this far. As I reached the landing, I saw it, the door at the end of the hall, the one that had been locked every time I tried to open it, the door that had been sealed shut. It was ajar now, a sliver of darkness visible beyond the frame. I couldn't resist. I walked toward it, my footsteps soft but deliberate. The closer I got, the more I could feel it, the cold, oppressive air, like a wall of ice surrounding the room. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. They were coming from inside that room. The house was begging me to enter. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. At least, at first, it seemed that way. The air was thick with the scent of something decayed, like rotten wood and damp earth. The walls were lined with old bookshelves, most of them empty except for a few stray volumes scattered across the floor. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, covered in dust and old papers. But it wasn't the table that caught my attention. It was the mirror. I had seen it before in the journal. The description of a mirror that had once belonged to the original owner of the house. A mirror that was said to show things that weren't there. Things that shouldn't exist. The reflection didn't just show you, it revealed you. Your darkest fears. Your deepest desires. I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward the mirror, my hand reaching out. As my fingers brushed the cold surface, I felt a shiver run down my spine, like the mirror itself was alive, feeding off my touch. And then, just like that, it changed. The reflection wasn't mine. It was someone else's, someone familiar. But the face was wrong, twisted. The eyes were wide and unblinking, The skin stretched thin over the bones. The mouth, it moved, but no sound came from it. The reflection began to scream, its face contorting in agony, but it wasn't real. It couldn't be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, the air thick with the feeling of suffocating dread. The mirror had shown me something, someone asterisk, that wasn't supposed to be here. And then a voice from behind me. You shouldn't have come back. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty again. The mirror, though, it was still reflecting that thing. That thing that wasn't me. The thing that had been waiting. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before. My feet barely touched the ground as I raced down the stairs, through the hall, and toward the door. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was hungry. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun it. I slammed the door open, but the night air hit me like a wall, colder than it had ever been. And as I looked up at the house one last time, I heard it, the whisper, soft and sweet, curling around my mind like a tendril. You'll never leave. And for the first time since I arrived, I believed it. The house had claimed me. It would never let me go. Not now. Not ever. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. My body was moving on its own, the adrenaline fueling each step, propelling me forward without a single thought of slowing down. The cold air bit at my skin, sharp and unrelenting, but nothing was colder than the dread that curled up inside me. That voice, it was still in my head, echoing, haunting. You'll never leave. I could hear it even as I sprinted down the street, even as the house disappeared from my sight. It was like a shadow, always lurking just behind my thoughts, a whisper that refused to fade. I tried to shake it off, but the more I thought about it, the stronger the fear became. It was as if the house had placed a mark on me, something that would never wash away. By the time I reached my car, my legs were trembling, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled for my keys, dropping them once, twice, before finally unlocking the door. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, I slammed the car into gear and sped away. Away from the house. Away from whatever had been waiting there for me. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing, but the weight of the air was heavier now, thicker, like something was pressing against the glass, just out of sight. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or something more, something real. I drove for hours, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The night passed in a blur of headlights and streetlights, the road stretching endlessly before me. I had no destination in mind, just away, as far away as I could get. But no matter how far I drove, the whispers wouldn't stop. They were inside me now, deep in my mind, in my very bones. I heard them when I was awake. I heard them when I tried to sleep. They followed me, relentless. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over to the side of the road, my breath shallow, the fear clawing at my throat. I couldn't stay in the car forever. I couldn't outrun it. That's when I noticed something strange. The reflection in the window. It wasn't just my own tired face staring back at me. It was different, twisted. The eyes were too wide, the skin too pale. A mouth opened in the reflection. But the words that came out weren't mine. You'll never leave. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook, reaching out to touch the glass, as if to wipe away the nightmare in front of me. But when I did, the reflection moved. It didn't match my movements. It stayed there, staring at me, smiling with a grin that stretched too far, too wide. And then the air in the car grew colder. The windows began to frost over, the chill creeping in even as I cranked the heat up to full blast. The sound of breathing, slow, deep, and steady, filled the space, coming from the back seat. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but no one was there. I was alone. Or was I? Don't turn around. The voice was unmistakable, the same one I had heard in the house. But now, it was inside the car, inside my head. I didn't listen. I couldn't. I had to know. I had to see if I was truly alone. Slowly, I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. The back seat was empty, just as it should have been. But as my eyes traveled toward the rearview mirror, I saw it. There was someone standing in the reflection. Someone standing right behind me. But when I turned again, nothing. My breathing was erratic now. My hands slick on the steering wheel. I had to leave. I had to get away from whatever this was, whatever had followed me. But the voice, the whisper, was louder now, overpowering, filling every inch of the car with its chilling certainty. You'll never leave. The reflection in the mirror twisted again, and that same figure appeared. Its face darkened, hollowed out, with deep, blackened eyes that stared into my soul. I could feel its gaze, burning into me, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the car jerking forward. But as I drove faster, the sound of footsteps started again, louder, closer, like someone was walking right beside me. My eyes darted to the mirror. The figure was there again, only now it was moving. It was closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep control of the car. And then it happened. The car swerved to the side of the road, out of my control, and I slammed into a tree with a violent crash. Everything went black. When I woke, I was alone. The car was still wrecked, but the figure, the thing, was gone. The whispers had stopped, but I wasn't free. I could feel it still, deep inside me. The house, the curse, the thing that had followed me, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear it. The door creaking open. It was waiting for me. I wish I could tell you I was finally free, that I had found peace. But the truth is, I don't know anymore. I left that night. I left the wreckage, the whispers, and the nightmares behind me. I moved to a new town, a new place, hoping that distance would erase it all. But it never does it? The past always catches up. It always finds you. The house is still out there. And I know, asterisk, that it's still waiting for someone else. Someone new to come. Someone to walk through that door. Someone to hear those whispers. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's already too late. But I'm done running. I've seen the truth. Whatever was inside that house, it never truly leaves. And one day, it will come for you, just like it came for me.